Hello, welcome back to the Phantom Diary channel. I'm sure there are many of you listening to my stories to fall asleep. Before we start, write in the comments what country you're listening from. So, let's go. I didn't believe in haunted houses. I didn't believe in much of anything that couldn't be explained with science and logic. But that was before I moved into the apartment on 3rd Street. The building was old, a rundown relic with peeling paint and creaky floors. I didn't expect much, but it was cheap, and after a string of bad luck, cheap was exactly what I needed. The first few nights were uneventful, just the usual sounds of an aging building. But then things started happening. It was the mirror. Had inherited an old, tarnished mirror from the previous tenant. The landlord mentioned it had been there for decades, but she didn't seem to care much about it. It was big, framed in dark wood, and hung directly across from my bed. At first, I thought it looked out of place, but I shrugged it off. I was just happy to have furniture. The first night, I noticed the reflection in the mirror. It wasn't my own face staring back, but a shape, a shadow, something that seemed almost human, but not quite. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and it was gone. I didn't think much of it. I had been under stress. Maybe it was just a trick of the light, or I was imagining things. But then, the next night, I saw it again, clearer this time. A figure standing just behind me in the reflection, watching. It was tall, thin, and unnaturally still. I spun around, but the room was empty. My heart raced as I approached the mirror. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with it, something that went beyond the odd reflection. I stared at myself in the glass, but the shadow was still there, lurking just out of focus like it was waiting for me to look away. That's when the noises started. At first, they were subtle, soft knocks from the other side of the wall. Then, scratching, sounds from the floorboards. It wasn't rats. I knew rats. These noises were deliberate, like something was trying to get in or get out. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt eyes on me, cold and unblinking. It wasn't until one night when I woke up to the sound of a door creaking open. I shot up, heart pounding. I glanced around the room, but everything was as it should be. Then I looked into the mirror. The figure was no longer just a shadow. It had a face now, pale, gaunt, eyes wide, and staring. I froze, staring back at it, unable to move. The reflection moved on its own, mimicking my every movement. But when I raised my hand to touch my face, the figure didn't. It stayed still, its eyes never leaving mine. Then it smiled. A slow, twisted grin that stretched too far, too wide. It reached a hand out to the glass, its fingers pressing against the mirror as if it wanted to come through. I backed away in terror, tripping over my blankets and falling to the floor. The reflection in the mirror remained the same, watching, waiting. The next morning, I tried to convince myself it was a dream. But the mirror was still there, the same warped surface, the same cold, unnerving presence. I couldn't look at it without feeling that thing watching me, just behind the glass. Desperate for answers, I asked the landlord about the mirror. Her face went pale, and she hesitated before speaking. It belonged to the tenant before you. She left in the middle of the night, just disappeared. We never found her. The police said there was no sign of struggle, no evidence of anything unusual, but her voice dropped to a whisper. The mirror was shattered when they came in. Only the glass was perfect. Not a crack or a scratch on it, but when they tried to move it, they said it felt wrong, like something was inside. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. I sat in the corner of the room, watching the mirror. My heart raced, my skin prickling with a cold sweat. The shadow in the glass was there again, closer than before. This time, it wasn't just standing. Still, it was moving, pacing, and with each step it took, I could feel the temperature in the room drop. I got up and grabbed the nearest thing I could find, a lamp, and smashed it against the mirror. The glass cracked, splintered, and for a moment, everything was still. Then the reflection moved. The thing in the glass twisted, its grin widening, and it lunged. But this time, it wasn't in the mirror anymore. I could feel its presence behind me. The air grew thick and heavy. I turned around, my breath caught in my throat. The thing was there. Its fingers brushed my shoulder, ice cold. I never stayed in that apartment again. The landlord offered to refund my deposit, but I refused to even look at the place. No one ever really told me what happened to the previous tenant, but the reflection, I think it was waiting for me all along. And I wonder, sometimes, if it's still there, watching, waiting for the next person to make the mistake of looking too long into the mirror. It was late when I boarded the last train home. The platform was empty, save for a few tired commuters scattered along the benches. I was grateful for the quiet after a long day. The train pulled in with a screech of metal, its lights flickering, like the last breath of a dying firefly. The doors opened and I stepped aboard, the stale air inside hitting me. The lights buzzed overhead, and the only sound was the steady hum of the engine as we began moving. I glanced around, but the train was nearly empty. Just me and an older man sitting at the far end. His eyes were fixed on the window, but something about him felt wrong. His stillness, his gaze, it was almost too intense. I chose a seat halfway down the car and tried to shake off the discomfort creeping up my spine. The train rattled along the tracks, its movement rhythmic and soothing. But the quiet soon began to feel oppressive, like the air itself was thickening. Minutes passed, and the train car grew colder. I could see my breath now, faint clouds drifting out with each exhale. I checked the time. It was well past midnight, but the real chill didn't come from the temperature. It was the silence. No one spoke. There was no soft tapping of feet, no distant chatter. The whole car seemed to hold its breath. I glanced at the man. He was still staring out the window, but I noticed something now. His reflection in the glass wasn't moving. His lips remained, frozen in the same thin line, his eyes unblinking. My stomach twisted. The train entered a tunnel. For a moment, everything went pitch black. I felt a jolt in my chest as the lights flickered, then came back on. Bright, too bright. My heart raced. The man hadn't moved, hadn't blinked, but now his reflection was smiling. I turned away quickly, fighting the rising panic in my chest. What was happening? I tried to focus on the outside, but the scenery was moving too fast. The shadows outside the window warped into grotesque shapes, stretching and bending like they were reaching for me. When I dared to glance back at the man, he was standing now. His hands were pressed against the window, his face inches away from the glass. I could see the reflection of his fingers, long, too long, like claws. I stood up, heart thumping wildly. "Excuse me," I called, but my voice felt weak, swallowed by the unnatural quiet. The man didn't respond. He was no longer just staring. His reflection had shifted. It now wore a twisted grin, eyes wide and filled with something dark. Suddenly, the train jerked violently, the lights flickering again. I stumbled, grabbing onto the nearest pole to keep from falling. The man's reflection laughed, silent, but the sound vibrated in my bones. I ran. I didn't care where I went, I just had to get away. The car felt smaller, the walls closing in on me. I reached the door to the next car and pulled it open, but it wasn't another car. It was an empty, black void. The train kept speeding through the dark tunnel, but the door I opened led to nothing, just an endless, suffocating darkness. I slammed the door shut in panic, stumbling back into the car. The lights flickered again, but this time they stayed off. The train was moving through total blackness now. I could hear something shifting in the darkness, faint whispers, too far to understand but close enough to make my skin crawl. The man's. Reflection was no longer in the window. The entire glass was dark, no reflection at all, just the oppressive blackness outside. And then, I heard it, the scraping. It came from behind me. Slowly, I turned. The man was there now, right in front of me. His face was twisted, his eyes wide and empty. His mouth stretched too far, a gaping black hole. The sound of his breathing was too deep, too slow. I tried to scream, but the sound caught in my throat. My chest felt tight, suffocating. And just as the man reached for me, the train lurched to a stop and the lights blazed back to life. I blinked. The train was back to normal. The car was empty. The man was gone. I was alone again. The doors opened at the next stop and I bolted off the train, breathless and shaking. The platform was crowded with people, their faces ordinary, unaware. I never saw that train again. But every night when I close my eyes, I hear the scraping, slow, deliberate, scratching the edges of my mind. The reflection, the smile, the man, he's still out there, waiting, and now sometimes I hear the train in the distance. I was driving back home from a business trip late at night, the road empty, the headlights illuminating nothing but endless stretches of dark highway. My car's engine hummed quietly, a lone vehicle in the vast expanse. The air was heavy with silence, and I kept my eyes trained on the road, the miles passing slowly. Then I saw her, a woman standing by the side of the road under the flickering glow of a streetlight. I wasn't sure at first if she was real. She wore a long, dark coat, her face obscured by the hood. My instinct was to drive on, but something about the figure made my foot ease off the gas. There was no town for miles, no houses. I slowed down, as I passed her, just to make sure she was all right. She didn't move. I continued driving, but then I heard something, a soft tapping on my window. I nearly jumped out of my skin. I hadn't seen her approach the car. There she was, standing at my side, her pale face now clearly visible through the glass. Her eyes were wide and hollow, black circles like pits that swallowed light. "Can you help me?" she whispered. I rolled down the window a crack, heart pounding. "Are you okay?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked over her shoulder as if something was watching her. Her breath came in shaky bursts. Then she spoke again. "Please, you have to let me in." Her voice was trembling, but there was an urgency in her tone I couldn't ignore. My mind raced. It was late, the roads were empty, and I was unsure whether this was some kind of trick, but I couldn't leave her here, not with her looking so desperate. I unlocked the door. She slid into the passenger seat without a word, and I could feel the chill she carried even though the air was warm. For a moment, there was complete silence except for the hum of the tires on the road. I glanced at her, trying to read her, but she kept her eyes fixed on the road ahead, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. "Where are you headed?" I asked. She didn't answer. I tried again. "Where do you need to go?" Nothing. A sense of unease settled over me. My gaze flickered to the rearview mirror and I froze. There was a figure standing in the middle of the road, behind us. A shadow, too dark for the moonlight to reveal any features. My stomach twisted. I looked at her, my voice suddenly hoarse. "Who? Who's that?" Her head turned sharply, her face twisting into something unrecognizable. Her eyes, those black pits, locked onto mine and her mouth parted into a grotesque smile. "You shouldn't have picked me up," she whispered. I didn't waste a second. My foot slammed on the accelerator, the car speeding forward, tires screeching. But when I glanced in the mirror again, the figure was closer than before. It was moving impossibly fast. Why is he following us? My voice trembled, my eyes darting between the road and the mirror. The woman in the passenger seat said nothing. Instead, she stared ahead, her hands now gripping the seat, her knuckles white. I could hear the tapping again, louder this time against the window. I risked another glance. The shadow was right behind us. so close that I could almost make out its shape, but the details were too blurry. I pushed the pedal to the floor, the engine roaring in protest. Then, suddenly, the tapping stopped. I turned to look at her, only to find the seat beside me completely empty. The door was wide open and the woman was gone. I slammed on the brakes, the car screeching to a halt, my heart hammering in my chest. Panic overtook me and I bolted from the car, looking around in a frenzy. But there was nothing. No woman. No shadow. Just the highway, stretching endlessly into the night. I shakily closed the car door, my breath shallow. What was happening? Then I heard it. The tapping, now, from inside the car. Slowly, I turned. The back seat was empty, but the faintest imprint of a figure sat there, a dark outline, barely visible in the dim light. The tapping came again, louder this time, from the back window. I turned around to look, and there, staring back at me from the rearview mirror, was the woman. Her face was pale, her eyes black voids, and she smiled, her teeth sharp and wrong. "You should have kept driving," she whispered, her voice echoing through the car as the world around me seemed to blur into darkness. Then, with a sudden jolt, everything stopped. I woke up in my car the next morning, alone on the side of the road. The sun was rising, casting long shadows across the empty highway. My mind was spinning. The events from the night before felt like a dream, but I knew they weren't. I glanced at the passenger seat, and there, on the floor, was a small item. A black, weathered key, unlike anything I had ever seen before. Didn't know what it opened, but I had a feeling I wasn't supposed to find out. I found the mirror in the attic of my new house, tucked behind an old wooden chest covered in dust. It wasn't anything special, just a full-length mirror with an ornate, faded gold frame. Still, I couldn't resist setting it up in my bedroom. It was one of those impulse decisions that seemed fine at the time, but later left me wondering why I'd done it. That night, I lay in bed, the soft hum of the house settling around me. The mirror reflected the faint glow of the moonlight that crept through the curtains, casting long shadows across the room. As I stared at my reflection, something felt wrong. It was subtle at first, just a flicker, a shadow that seemed to move in the glass when it shouldn't have. I shook it off, thinking it was just the tiredness messing with my mind. But the next night, the feeling didn't go away. As I stood in front of the mirror brushing my teeth, I saw something I shouldn't have. My reflection wasn't matching my movements. I froze, watching in disbelief as the image of myself in the mirror smiled at me. It wasn't a smile I had made. My reflection grinned wide, eyes gleaming with something dark and malicious. I quickly turned away, heart hammering, and looked back. The reflection was back to normal, just like mine. That's when it started. The whispers. I'd hear them, soft and low, coming from the direction of the mirror. At first, I thought it was just the wind or the house settling, but then the whispers became words. Clear, distinct. They seemed to speak directly to me. Come closer. Look again. One night, unable to resist, I approached the mirror. My heart raced in my chest as I stood before it, staring at the glass. The whispering grew louder, and my reflection this time moved before I did, slowly raising its hand to touch the mirror. I reached out, feeling the cool surface beneath my fingertips, but the reflection's hand didn't stop at the glass. It pressed against it, and I felt a cold, unnatural pressure on my own hand as though something was pulling at me from the other side. Suddenly, the mirror shook violently. The whispering grew into frantic voices urging me to step forward. I stepped back, panic rising in my throat, but the reflection didn't stop. It stepped out of the glass. I gasped, stumbling backward. The figure before me was a twisted version of myself, its face distorted into an expression of rage, its eyes wide and wild. It was no longer human. It was something else. The reflection grinned, and that's when I understood. It wasn't my reflection at all. It had been waiting, watching, wanting to take my place. I turned and ran, but the figure followed me, its movements jerky and unnatural. I heard it laughing behind me, that twisted, mocking sound, echoing in the dark halls. In my panic, I tried to escape the house, but the door wouldn't open. I ran back toward the bedroom, my heart pounding. The figure was still there, standing in the doorway now, grinning wider, its eyes full of malice. "You can't escape," it whispered. "I've been waiting for so long." With a burst of adrenaline, I shoved past the figure and grabbed the mirror, yanking it from the wall with all my strength. I threw it onto the floor with a crash, the glass shattering into 1,000 pieces. The room went silent. I stood there, trembling, the broken shards reflecting bits of the room, fragments of myself scattered across the floor. The air felt different now, calmer, still. But then, from the shards, I heard it again, the whisper. "You can't escape." I rushed out of the house that night, leaving everything behind. I never looked back. I never spoke of it to anyone. But sometimes when I stand in front of a mirror, I see it in the corner of my vision, the twisted reflection, waiting for me to come too close. It was late when I finally got the message. "I'm outside." I wasn't expecting anyone. My phone buzzed again. "Please, let me in." But there was no name attached. I checked the front porch camera, but the screen was just static. No one stood there. I was alone in my small, rented house in the woods, miles from the nearest neighbor, and I had made sure to lock all doors and windows. I sat up, my heart pounding. Maybe it was some prankster, but the urgency in the messages felt real. The way they were worded, like whoever was out there needed something. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, just in case. The operator answered quickly. "What's your emergency?" "I think someone's outside my house. I don't know who they are. I don't recognize the number they texted from." "Stay inside. We'll send someone right away," the operator said. The line went silent except for the faint hum of static. As I waited, the lights flickered. Then, from the window, I saw it. A shadow, shifting just outside the glass. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but then it moved again. A dark silhouette crouching low. I froze. The figure came closer to the window and I could hear faint tapping. Not a knock, but something softer, almost as if fingers were brushing against the glass. I backed away, my breath caught in my throat. My phone buzzed again, a new message. "I can see you." My heart raced. I backed into the corner of the room, my eyes glued to the window, scanning the darkness outside. That shadow. It was still there. I moved cautiously to the door, trying to peer through the peephole. Nothing. The porch light flickered. Then I heard something new, scratching. It was coming from the back of the house. It sounded like nails dragging along the wood. I wanted to scream, but my throat was dry, and fear held me still. A sudden sound made me whirl around. The front door. It was opening, slowly. I didn't hear the key turn, didn't hear the lock click, yet it crept open on its own. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice trembling. No answer. The door swung wide. That's when I saw it. A figure standing in the doorway. Not a person. The thing had no face, just dark, hollow pits where eyes should have been. Its hands were long and thin, ending in sharp, claw-like nails that scraped the floor as it inched forward. I stepped back, my pulse pounding in my ears. It took another slow step toward me, its head tilting slightly as though curious. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body refused to move. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed from the back of the house. It was enough to snap me out of my frozen state. I ran, past the faceless thing in the doorway, past the sound of its slow, rasping breaths. I bolted into the kitchen, grabbing a knife from the counter, my hands shaking. The figure was gone, but I wasn't alone. I heard the whispers first, soft voices coming from every corner of the house. low and unintelligible, but unmistakable. Then the walls began to shudder as though something immense was pressing against them. A thud shook the ceiling. Something heavy was moving overhead. I backed toward the kitchen window, my fingers fumbling for the lock. But then I saw it. The figure was standing on the roof, its hollow face turned toward me. I stumbled back, horrified. I wasn't alone in the house. The whispers grew louder until they were no longer whispers. They were voices. "Let us in. We're not done. We see you." I opened the window in one swift motion, desperate to escape, but the moment I did, the voices erupted into a deafening shriek. I dove out the window, landing in the dirt below, scrambling to my feet. I didn't look back as I ran for the woods. The house, the figure, the voices, they were all behind me now. When I reached the edge of the trees, I looked back one last time. The house stood in the distance, dark and silent. But I knew, deep down, it wasn't over. I checked my phone. The text was still there, the last one that had arrived. It had changed. "You let us in." I'd just moved into a cheap apartment in a run-down building on the outskirts of the city. The rent was ridiculously low, so when I saw the listing, I didn't hesitate. The landlord, an older man with a deep, unsettling gaze, told me it was a quiet place. No noise, no trouble. The apartment was small, but it had a view of the alleyway behind the building, which was fine. The first few days were normal enough. I unpacked, got comfortable, and settled into my routine. But there was something strange about the place. A quiet hum filled the air at night, faint but constant. At first, I thought it was just the building settling, but then I started hearing things. Footsteps above me when no one was up there, whispers from the walls, muffled sounds I couldn't place. One evening, as I sat in my living room, I noticed something out of place. The door to the apartment next to mine, Apton 2B, was slightly ajar. I hadn't seen anyone go in or out for days, and it felt odd to see the door open like that. Curious, I walked over and knocked gently, but no answer came. I hesitated for a moment and then pushed the door open. The apartment was empty. The floors were dusty and the furniture had a layer of neglect to it. But there was something even more unsettling. The door to the bathroom was shut. I slowly approached it, heart pounding in my chest. When I pushed it open, I was met with darkness. The window was covered with old newspapers blocking any light. Then I saw it. A single red mark on the floor, like something had been dragged through it. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I backed out quickly, closing the door with a shaky breath. That night, I couldn't sleep. The sounds from the walls were louder. Now, scratching, tapping, like something was trying to get out. I got up and checked the hallway, but it was silent. When I returned to my apartment, I noticed a shadow at the edge of my vision, moving in the corner of the room. My pulse quickened. The next morning, I decided to go downstairs and ask the landlord about the strange apartment. He was in his office, his expression unreadable when I asked about 2B. "It's been vacant for a while," he said, his voice cold. "It's best if you stay away from that one. The last tenant, well, let's just say she left unexpectedly." I frowned, but he didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. I had seen enough. That night, as I lay in bed, the noises returned, louder than ever. A soft, distant cry followed by a sharp knock on my door. My heart raced. I didn't want to answer. I didn't want to know what was waiting outside, but something pushed me. I opened the door to find the hallway dark, the light flickering. The air was thick, heavy, as if it had been waiting for me. And then I heard it, a whisper so close it sent chills through my body. "She's back." I whipped around, but there was nothing. I quickly shut the door, bolting it behind me. As the night wore on, the room grew colder and the noises intensified. Scratching, thumping, and then the unmistakable sound of footsteps approaching. Someone was walking down the hallway outside my door. My breath caught in my throat. I glanced through the peephole, but there was no one there. Just darkness. Then the footsteps stopped, and the air became eerily still. I couldn't stay. I grabbed my things and bolted from the apartment, not looking back. I ran down the stairwell, only to stop when I saw the landlord standing at the bottom, blocking the exit. His expression had changed. His eyes no longer held the same unsettling calm. They were wild, desperate. "You shouldn't have left," he said softly. "Now, you're part of the building." I turned to run the other way, but the hall seemed to stretch endlessly. The walls closed in around me, and I heard the same whisper, louder now. "She's back." Suddenly, I wasn't alone. The tenant, whoever she was there, standing in the hallway, her face twisted and pale, eyes hollow as if drained of all light. With one last scream, I ran toward the front door and threw myself out of the building, into the night air. I don't know how I escaped, but when I looked back, the building stood in silence, just as it had before. But I knew it was waiting. The landlord was gone. And Aptner 2B? It was still there, its door wide open, inviting anyone who would dare step in next, and I knew deep down the building would never let me go. I'd never believed in ghosts until the day I moved into the old house on Maple Street. It was the kind of place people would tell stories about, the house everyone avoided. But it was cheap, and I needed somewhere to live. The place was big, almost too big for one person, but I didn't care. I unpacked, set up my furniture, and tried to ignore the unsettling creaks and groans the house made every time the wind blew. The first few nights were uneventful, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It was the way the house seemed to hum when it was quiet, like it was alive. Then there was the window. It was in the upstairs room, one I didn't plan to use at first. It was the largest window in the house, but the view was of nothing but a dense, dark forest. I kept the curtains drawn, but sometimes when I passed by it, I swore I saw something in the reflection. A shadow moving in the corner of the glass, even when I was alone. One night, as I sat in the living room, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps above me. Slow, deliberate steps. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. The sound was so clear it couldn't have been my imagination. But when I went upstairs to check, the hallway was empty. I chalked it up to the house settling. After all, it was old. But the feeling of being watched didn't go away. I'd be lying if I said I didn't feel like someone, or something, was always just behind me. The real nightmare began a few days later. I was in bed, trying to sleep, when I heard it. Again, the footsteps. This time, they were louder. They moved across the floor above me, stopping in front of the door to that room with the window. I tried to tell myself it was the house, the wind, my own tired mind playing tricks. But the door to that room creaked open, just a little, as if someone had pushed it slightly ajar. I stayed still, heart pounding in my throat. I wanted to move, but my body wouldn't obey. The room was bathed in moonlight, and I could just barely make out the shape of the window through the crack in the door. And then I saw it. A face. Not a reflection, but a real, living face pressed up against the window. Eyes wide, filled with terror. My breath caught in my throat as I watched, paralyzed. The face seemed to twist, the eyes widening further as the figure raised its hand to the glass, leaving streaks of moisture behind. I scrambled out of bed, rushing to the window. But when I threw open the curtains, there was nothing outside, just the dark, empty forest. The face was gone. The next day, I did some research on the house. There had been an old family who lived there years ago, but their story didn't end. Well, the parents had vanished, leaving behind their 2 children who were never found. Rumor had it the house was cursed. No one had ever dared live there for long. That night, I decided to leave. I couldn't take it anymore. As I packed, I heard the footsteps again. But this time, they were different. They were coming from downstairs. I grabbed my bag and rushed toward the front door. But when I opened it, I froze. Standing in the doorway was the child. A small, pale figure with wide eyes staring at me, its mouth stretched in a strange grin. I slammed the door, my heart racing. The footsteps above me started again, but now they were not alone. Other footsteps, smaller, lighter, joined, them moving together in a slow, steady rhythm. Suddenly, the room grew cold. I turned around, my eyes darting to the window, and that's when I saw it. The face. This time, there was no mistaking it. The child's face stared at me through the glass, eyes unblinking, its mouth open in a silent scream. I backed away, terrified, and just as I turned to run, the door behind me slammed shut. The footsteps stopped and an eerie silence filled the house. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I grabbed my phone, dialed the first number I could think of, and ran out of the house without a second thought. I was gone in minutes. The cold, night air biting at my skin as I heard one last thing. The sound of soft, slow footsteps following me. When I finally turned back, the house stood there in the distance, the window lit by the dim glow of the moon. And for a moment, I thought I saw the face again, staring back at me. I never went back to that house. And to this day, when I pass by Maple Street, I always glance at the window, half expecting to see that face staring out. It was late when I arrived at the old house, the one I had inherited from my estranged uncle. It was situated on the outskirts of town, where the road faded into dark woods. The house looked as though it hadn't been touched in years, its windows dusty and the front steps creaking under my weight as I made my way up to the door. I didn't know much about my uncle. He was a recluse, never one for visitors, and I'd only seen him a few times during my childhood. When he passed, he left everything to me. His house, his belongings, and, strangely, a note that simply read, "Do not go into the basement." As I stepped inside, the cold air hit me, and the smell of mildew and old wood filled my nose. The house was quiet. Too quiet. It was as if it was holding its breath. I turned on the lights, but they flickered before finally settling on a dim glow. The wallpaper was peeling, the furniture covered in sheets like the house had been frozen in time. I spent the first few hours unpacking, trying to make myself comfortable. But the strange atmosphere of the house made it impossible to shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every creak of the floorboards above, every gust of wind rattling the windows felt intentional, like someone, was moving just out of sight. Then I heard it, a soft, slow tapping from below. I froze, holding my breath. The sound came from the basement, the place my uncle had warned me about. My first instinct was to ignore it, but curiosity gnawed at me, louder than the sound. What could it be? The house was old, sure, but was it old enough to make noises like that? I grabbed a flashlight and walked toward the basement door. It was a heavy wooden door with a tarnished doorknob that creaked when I touched it. With a shiver, I turned the handle and opened it. The stairs descended into darkness, the beam from my flashlight barely cutting through the pitch-black air. The tapping had stopped. I stood there, frozen. The silence pressed against my ears, louder than the sound had been. I thought about turning back, but something tugged at me, something primal. I needed to know what was down there. I descended the stairs cautiously, each step groaning under my weight. As I reached the bottom, I pointed the flashlight around the room. It was large, lined with old crates and cobwebs, but nothing moved. Then, the tapping started again. It was much louder this time, closer. It was as if it was right behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing. My flashlight shook in my hand as I scanned the room, the beam catching on something at the far corner. A figure, a tall, gaunt figure, standing still and motionless in the dark. It was human, but its features were distorted, stretched. Its eyes were wide open, unblinking, staring directly at me. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. My body screamed at me to run, but my legs were paralyzed. The figure tilted its head slowly, and I could hear a faint whisper in the air. "Help me." The voice was soft, almost a hiss, but it carried through the air, sinking into my skin. I took a step back, my heart pounding. My flashlight flickered and then went out. Darkness. I fumbled with the flashlight, trying to turn it back on, but it wouldn't respond. That's when I heard it. A loud thud coming from behind me, followed by the unmistakable sound of shuffling, footsteps. The air felt thick, suffocating, and I could feel a presence creeping up on me. I spun around again, but this time, there was no figure. Nothing. Just the empty basement, except the tapping had returned, louder than before. It wasn't coming from the corner, though. It was coming from behind me, directly from the ceiling above. Thud. Thud. Tap. I backed up toward the stairs, and that's when I saw it. Something in the ceiling. A small hole, like something had been clawing its way out from inside. The tapping grew louder. I didn't think. I ran. I bolted up the stairs, pushing the door open with such force that it nearly flew off its hinges. I slammed it shut behind me, my breath ragged in my chest. I stood there, staring at the door, my heart racing. I couldn't explain what I had just seen, or heard. Suddenly, the phone in my pocket buzzed. I took it out, my hands shaking. It was a text message from an unknown number. I opened it. "Don't go into the basement." My uncle's words echoed in my mind, but it was too late. The tapping had stopped, but now I could hear something else, a slow, steady breathing from the other side of the basement door. I've always liked quiet places. A small, remote town tucked away from the rest of the world seemed like the perfect getaway for me, especially after the chaos of my city life. So, when I found a listing for an old house to rent near a church, with a bell tower, I didn't think twice. The house was cheap, charming, and isolated. The perfect retreat. The first few days were peaceful. The church, with its ancient stone walls and weathered wooden doors, stood at the end of a narrow dirt road, visible from my window. It had always struck me as eerie, but in a beautiful way. The bell tower rose high above the trees, and every evening at dusk, the bell would ring. It was a deep, resonant sound, and it seemed to shake the ground. At first, I didn't mind it. In fact, it felt like part of the charm. But by the fourth day, I started noticing something strange. The bell rang at random times, not just at dusk. Sometimes it would toll in the middle of the night, echoing through the valley, waking me from a deep sleep. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, a broken mechanism or the wind, but it felt wrong, unnatural. One evening, I decided to go see it for myself. I walked through the overgrown grass, the setting sun casting long shadows on the path. The door to the church creaked open as I pushed it. The smell of mildew hit me and the air inside felt damp. I hesitated at the entrance, looking up at the tower that loomed above me like a dark sentinel. The church was empty, but I could hear something, faint like a whisper. I couldn't make out the words, but the voice was unmistakable. It wasn't coming from the tower. It was coming from inside the church, from somewhere deep in the building. I moved cautiously toward the source of the sound, my footsteps echoing through the hollow space. The floorboards creaked beneath me. The whispering grew louder as I approached the altar where an old wooden door was slightly ajar. The voice was clear now, too clear. "Leave." I froze. The voice was not a gentle plea, but an urgent command. The hairs on my neck stood on end. I turned back toward the door, but before I could leave, the bell began to toll again. This time, louder, more violent. The sound seemed to shake the walls, rattling my bones. I stumbled backward in panic, but the door to the church slammed, shut behind me. I tried to push it open, but it wouldn't budge. I was trapped. The whispering grew into a cacophony of voices, all calling to me, chanting words I couldn't understand. The bell tolls had stopped, replaced by a low, guttural noise that reverberated through my chest. I looked up and saw something that made my blood run cold. The bell tower was no longer still. It was moving, shifting, like a dark figure was taking shape inside it. I could make out the faintest outline of a man, no, a thing, standing in the tower. Its face was obscured by shadows, but its eyes, I will never forget those eyes. They were glowing with an unnatural light burning through the darkness. A voice, not a whisper this time, boomed in the church. "You shouldn't have come," I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the oppressive atmosphere. The figure in the tower moved, its limbs stretching unnaturally, and I realized with horror that it was descending, coming down toward me. I ran. The door to the church suddenly flew open, but I didn't stop to question it. I bolted down the path, my heart racing as the bell tolled once more, deafening, shaking the earth beneath my feet. I didn't look back. When I reached my house, I slammed the door shut and locked every window, but I couldn't escape the feeling of being watched, of something lingering just outside. I could hear the toll of the bell, even now, in my mind, constant, unrelenting. That night, I woke up to the sound of the bell tolling again. It was midnight, but it was not the usual toll. This time the bell rang 3 times in rapid succession, followed by a silence that was more terrifying than the noise. I heard a knock at the door. My heart stopped. I didn't move, didn't breathe. The knock came again, slow, deliberate. The door creaked open. I could see the silhouette of a figure, standing in the doorway. It wasn't a man, but something else. I couldn't see its face, only the faint glow of those glowing eyes, and then I heard the whisper again, only this time, it wasn't in the church. It was right next to me. Leave, but it was too late. The figure stepped forward, and the last thing I saw was the glowing eyes before everything went black. I didn't want to stay in the apartment, but I had no choice. It was temporary, just a few months until I found something more permanent. It was a top-floor unit in an old building, the kind with creaky stairs and faded wallpaper, but it was cheap, and that's all that mattered to me. The first few nights were uneventful. The neighbors kept to themselves, and the city noise felt distant, muffled by the thick walls. But after a week, something strange started happening. At night, when everything was still, I would hear a faint sound. It started small, just a tap, like something delicate being knocked against the floor. I'd freeze, listening, but the noise would stop as soon as I tried to find its source. At first, I figured it was just the building settling, some odd noises from pipes or loose floorboards, but it kept happening, every night without fail. It wasn't until I was in the living room one evening, alone, that I heard it again. A tap, then another. I stood up, my heart racing, and walked toward the center of the room. The noise was coming, from below me, from the floor. It was faint at first, but it grew louder as I listened, almost rhythmic. I knelt down, pressing my ear against the floor. It sounded like something scraping, a slow, deliberate motion. The apartment was empty. I was alone. I stood up quickly, heart thudding in my chest. The noise stopped immediately. I stared at the floor, wondering if I had imagined it. The next few nights, it was worse. The tapping became sharper, like a set of nails or something harder, hitting the wood in a steady pattern. Sometimes it sounded like scratching, other times, a rhythmic thumping. I would wake up in the middle of the night, my pulse pounding in my ears, listening as it came from below, from under the floor. I couldn't ignore it anymore. The building was old, but it felt like the noise was coming from something more alive. I called the landlord, but he dismissed it as just old house noises. He suggested I leave a note for the neighbors below to see if they heard it too. The neighbors were quiet and they always kept to themselves. I wrote the note, slipped it under their door, and waited. A day later, I got a reply. "We don't hear anything." I wanted to scream, to tell them that something was wrong, but I held it together. That night, the tapping was louder than ever, shaking the floor beneath me. But this time, it wasn't just tapping. It was a thudding, a sharp, desperate banging against the floor. Something was scraping, dragging itself across the wood beneath me. My heart pounded in my chest as I stood frozen in the middle of the room. Suddenly, the banging stopped. The silence was worse than the noise. Then, from below, I heard a voice. "Let me out." The words were soft at first, a whisper that barely reached my ears. But the longer I listened, the clearer they became. The voice wasn't coming from the walls. It was coming from below, from the very floor itself. "Let me out. Please." I stumbled back, my head spinning. The voice was pleading now, desperate. I could feel the cold sweat trickling down my spine. I grabbed my phone, ready to call someone, anyone, but before I could, the voice broke through again. "I can hear you. I'm here." The words hit me like a punch. The voice, it knew I was there. It wasn't just asking to be let out. It was warning me. I backed away from the floor, terrified, but something urged me to look closer. There was a small crack in the wood, barely noticeable, but it was enough. The edges of the crack seemed to be moving, as though something was trying to push through from below. Then I saw it. A hand. A pale, bony hand appeared through the crack, fingers splayed wide as though it was reaching for me. The fingers scraped against the floorboards, the sound like nails on chalkboard, and I recoiled, almost falling backward in panic. I didn't wait to see more. I ran out of the apartment, slamming the door behind me. I didn't care where I went. I just needed to get away. I stayed with a friend for a week, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was in that apartment was still waiting, still trying to get out. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. I couldn't stop thinking about the hand, what it wanted, what it was. When I finally returned to pack up my things, I found that the apartment was empty. The floors scraped clean of the cracks and scratches. There was no sign of the hand, no sound of tapping, nothing out of place. But when I left, I saw it. The neighbor's door was open, and through the crack I saw them, just standing there, watching me. Their eyes were dark, empty, and in the stillness, I heard the same voice from below, soft but chilling. "You shouldn't have left." I was driving alone through the back roads, far from the nearest town. The kind of roads that twisted like veins in the dark, where even your headlights seemed to struggle to light the way. It was late, past midnight, and the fog had rolled in thick. My windshield wipers fought against it, but the mist clung to the glass, blurring my vision. The radio was silent, not even static, just an empty hum. Then the voice crackled through. "Turn back," it whispered, just loud enough for me to hear. I slammed the volume dial, but the voice didn't stop. It continued, just a breath above the static. "Turn back. Now." I froze, gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles went white. The voice was soft, eerily calm. No mistake, it came from the radio. But I knew no one had touched the dial. I had been alone in the car. I glanced at the road ahead, but it felt like I wasn't moving at all. My headlights barely pierced the fog, and something in my gut twisted. My heart raced, thudding like a drum. I wasn't sure if I should keep driving, but I pressed on. The fog thickened, and my car slowed of its own accord as though the road itself was pulling me in. The voice continued. "You're not alone." My eyes darted nervously to the rearview mirror. Nothing but white. But that's when I heard it. A low, whistling sound. Soft at first, like a breeze through the trees. But it was close. Too close. It was a tune, almost melodic but haunting, like a lullaby from a nightmare. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm, but my pulse wouldn't slow. The road ahead twisted, the fog so dense now that it felt like a wall pressing in from all sides. The whistling grew louder. It wasn't coming from the radio anymore. It was coming from outside the car, a slow, deliberate whistle, the kind that you'd hear from someone walking behind you, following you. I couldn't see anything in the rearview mirror. No shadow, no silhouette. But the sound was unmistakable. Someone was out there. I needed to get out of the fog, fast. But the more I drove, the more the whistling seemed to draw closer, matching my speed. Then, a sharp gust of wind slammed into my side window, rattling the glass. My hands were shaking as I gripped the wheel tighter. That's when I saw it. A figure just ahead, standing by the side of the road. I nearly slammed on the brakes, hard in my throat, but I couldn't. I was frozen. The figure was tall, gaunt, its face hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat. A dark coat billowed in the mist around it, and in its hand was a lantern. A single, flickering light, illuminating only the figure's shadowed form. I slammed the brakes, coming to a screeching halt just inches from the figure. The whistling stopped. Everything stopped. My headlights now illuminated the figure fully. It didn't move. It just stood there, staring at me from beneath the brim of the hat, the light from its lantern casting an eerie glow. I could barely breathe. It was as if time had frozen. But then it took a step forward. One slow, deliberate step. And that's when the radio blared to life again. The voice was no longer a whisper. It was louder now, urgent. "Run! Don't let it in!" The figure didn't move. It was still standing in the fog, but I could feel the air shift. A presence, a cold that made my bones ache. My foot was on the gas, before I could think. I didn't care anymore. I just needed to get away. My tires screamed against the gravel as I sped off, the figure disappearing into the mist behind me. I didn't stop again. I didn't look back. When I finally reached a gas station miles down the road, I didn't feel safe. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me, that something was still out there. The station attendant stared at me with wide eyes when I pulled up. He didn't say anything at first, just looked at me like I was crazy. "Are you all right?" he asked finally, his voice shaking. I couldn't find words. I just pointed to the radio. The dial was still flickering, static, buzzing. He nodded grimly and reached behind the counter, pulling out an old map. "You didn't hear the whistling, did you?" he asked. I nodded slowly, my chest tight. "What is it?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he scribbled something on the map. "Stay on the main roads. Whatever you do, don't take the back roads at night. It calls to you." He handed me the map, his eyes full of something I couldn't name, something dark. "The Whistler doesn't let you leave once. You've heard it." I couldn't bring myself to ask him what that meant. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time, half expecting to see that lantern's light, but the road behind me was empty. The voice on the radio never came back. The whistling never followed me again, but I never drove those back roads again. I don't even know what I would have done if I had, and I'll never forget that cold whisper, "You're not alone." I moved into my new apartment a few weeks ago, the one in the old brick building at the edge of town. The rent was cheap, and I wasn't picky. The place had its quirks, creaky floors, peeling wallpaper, but it was mine. I liked the solitude. It was the middle of the night when it first happened. I had just gotten into bed, my lights off, and the apartment silent, when I heard the knock. One knock, clear and deliberate. I froze. It came from the door. I thought it was a mistake, maybe a neighbor, but when I checked the peephole, no one was there. I stood there for a moment, trying to calm myself. Maybe I was just imagining things. I locked the door again and went back to bed, the silence thick in the air. A few nights later, the knock came again. Just one. At first, I thought it was some prank, but as I stood in front of the door this time, I noticed something strange. The hallway light was flickering. It wasn't a power surge, more like something else, something unnatural, like it was struggling to stay on. My pulse quickened. I leaned in closer to the door and put my ear against it. The silence was almost suffocating until I heard a soft whisper. "You're not alone." My blood ran cold. There was no one out there. I backed away from the door, shaking. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat on the couch, staring at the door, waiting for the next sound, the next knock. I didn't hear anything for a while, but then, there it was. The knock came again, louder this time. I jumped. The apartment felt colder, the shadows seemed longer. But this time, I did something different. I grabbed a kitchen knife and slowly unlocked the door, heart hammering in my chest. When I opened it, I saw nothing. The hallway was empty, the light still flickering. There was no one there. I checked the other apartments, but no one was around. I closed the door, my mind racing. What was going on? I felt like I was losing my grip on reality. The knocks kept coming, always at night, always the same. One knock, and then that voice. "You're not alone." Finally, after days of sleepless nights, I decided to confront whatever it was. I waited, the knife in my hand, as the clock ticked toward midnight. As soon as the knock sounded, I rushed to the door. But this time, something was different. The door was moving on its own. It creaked open a fraction, and I could see a shadow through the gap. I didn't want to open it further, but I couldn't stop myself. My hand reached out and I pushed the door open completely. The hallway was darker now, darker than it had ever been. I could barely see anything. But then I saw it. There, standing at the end of the hall, a figure, tall and thin, its face hidden in shadows. It was wearing something that looked like an old, tattered coat, its arms long and unnaturally thin. I couldn't make out any features, just the shape of it standing still, waiting. For the first time, I felt pure terror. The thing didn't move, didn't speak, but I could feel its presence. I could feel it in my bones. I slammed the door shut. The knock came again. But this time, I didn't answer. Instead, I ran. I grabbed my things, my keys, and bolted out of the apartment, down the stairs, through the lobby. I didn't stop running until I was outside. I called the landlord the next morning, explained everything. He listened quietly, then told me something that made my stomach twist. "You're not the first to report this," he said. "The building, it has a history." "History?" I asked, my voice shaking. "The knock, the visitor. It's been here for years. Every tenant hears it. It's always the same. One knock, and then it shows up." I wanted to scream, but all I could do was hang up. I never went back. To this day, I never hear a knock when I'm at home. But sometimes, late at night when I'm alone, I hear a whisper. "You're not alone." It was supposed to be a quick ride home. I had missed the last bus, and the only option left was the late-night train, which was notoriously empty at this hour. As the train doors closed behind me, I realized there was no one else in the car. I shrugged it off, no big deal, just a quiet ride. The lights flickered once, then settled into a soft hum. The train started moving, its wheels clicking against the tracks, almost too rhythmically. As I glanced out the window, the city was swallowed by the dark. I was now passing through the outskirts, where the trees pressed in against the track. Few stops passed, and the train was still eerily empty. I tried to focus on my phone, scrolling through mindless social media posts, but my mind kept wandering. There was something unsettling about the stillness, the silence. A shiver ran down my spine. Then the door at the far end of the car slid open. A man stepped in, tall, with dark hair and an old-fashioned trench coat that swayed as he moved. He didn't look at me, just made his way to the seat directly across from me, sitting with his back to the window. His presence felt odd, out of place. I noticed his shoes, too, polished black leather, the kind that felt like they hadn't been worn in years. I didn't say anything, just stared at him. He didn't seem to notice, or if he did, he gave no sign. The silence stretched longer than I was comfortable with, and the train rumbled louder as we hurtled through the darkness. After a few minutes, I saw something strange. A reflection in the glass. The man's reflection didn't match his movements. His head was tilted slightly forward, but his reflection stared straight ahead. I blinked and looked away, chalking it up to the weird lighting in the train. But the feeling of unease stuck. The train screeched as it slowed for the next stop, but something was wrong. The doors didn't open. Instead, they remained sealed shut. I pressed the button to call the conductor, but nothing happened. The man turned his head slowly toward me, his eyes glimmering like he had been waiting for this exact moment. "You shouldn't have gotten on," he whispered, his voice sending a chill down my spine. My breath caught in my throat. My fingers tightened around my phone, but I couldn't look away. "The train never stops," he said again, his lips barely moving. Suddenly, the lights flickered again, this time much longer than before. When they came back on, the man was gone. No door had opened, no sound of him leaving. He had simply vanished. My heart raced and I grabbed the nearest handle, trying to open the door myself. Nothing. The walls felt oppressive, closing in on me. Panic crept into my chest. I pounded on the emergency button by the door, but still, nothing. The train roared through the darkness, faster now, shaking violently as though it had been jolted into overdrive. I stumbled back into my seat, clutching the armrests. My mind raced with thoughts of what the man had said. The train never stops. Suddenly, I heard a sound. Soft, faint, like someone was whispering. The voice wasn't from the direction of the door, it was right behind me. I whipped around, but no one was there. The whispering continued, growing louder. "Get off the train. It's too late." My blood ran cold. I tried the door again, but it was locked. I could see the next stop approaching through the window, but the train didn't slow. The station passed by in a blur, and the train only gained speed. I heard a faint click like a key turning in a lock. Then the man reappeared, this time standing beside me, his face inches from mine, his cold breath on my neck. "You can't leave. You'll be with us now," he murmured. I screamed and tried to shove him away, but my hands passed right through him. He wasn't real. The train wasn't real. The reflection in the window changed. Instead of the dark landscape outside, I saw another car, filled with people. They were all staring at me, their eyes hollow, their faces expressionless. They didn't move, and I realized with a sickening jolt, they were all dead. I was surrounded by ghosts. The man smiled, his face splitting wide. "You're the last one," he said softly. "The train always finds someone new." I fought to breathe, to scream, but no sound came out. The train wasn't slowing. The dark figures in the reflection were coming closer, pressing against the glass. I could feel their cold hands on my skin, tugging me toward them. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the train jerked to a stop. The lights went out, and everything fell silent. When I opened my eyes, I was standing on the platform of an empty station. The train was gone. The night was still, and the air was thick with the smell of rust and decay. I ran, not stopping until I reached the nearest street. My phone had no signal, no record of the train, and the time was frozen at 11:59. The worst part? The next night, I saw a missing persons poster with my own face on it, dated the night before. It started like any other night. I was home alone, sitting in my apartment in the city. It was just past midnight and I was scrolling through my phone trying to kill time before heading to bed. The hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen was the only sound in the quiet apartment. Then the phone rang. I glanced at the screen. No name, just a number I didn't recognize. Normally, I'd ignore it, but something compelled me to answer. Maybe it was the silence pressing in around me, or maybe just curiosity. "Hello?" I said, trying to keep my voice steady. There was a long pause on the other end, followed by a strange sound, like a crackling static, followed by the faintest whisper. "Hello?" I repeated, louder this time. The voice was barely audible, but I heard it clearly enough. "I can see you." My heart skipped a beat. It was so soft, so casual, it sent a chill down my spine. I quickly pulled the phone away from my ear, staring at the screen, convinced it was some kind of prank. But the number was still there. No name, just the same. Strange digits I didn't recognize. "Who is this?" I demanded, trying to stay calm. The voice didn't respond. The static came back, louder this time, and the whisper followed. "I can see you. You're not alone." A cold sweat broke out across my forehead. I was sure someone was playing a sick joke. But why would they say that? I was alone. Completely alone. I looked around the dark apartment, my eyes scanning every corner. The room felt smaller, suffocating. Suddenly, there was a loud thud coming from the hallway outside my door. I froze, staring at the door as my heartbeat quickened. My mind raced. There was no one in the building at this hour, just me. The phone line crackled again. "I'm getting closer." I swallowed hard. Fear began to crawl up my spine. My mind was spinning, and I couldn't think straight. I dropped the phone, my hands shaking, and slowly stood up. I tiptoed toward the door, heart pounding in my chest. The hallway was silent. I cracked the door open just a sliver, enough to peer out. The lights were dim in the hallway, casting long shadows. There was no one. But then I saw it, on the floor. Just outside my door, a single red rose lying perfectly still. My breath caught in my throat. The rose looked freshly picked, the petals bright and red against the dull gray carpet. My mind raced as I backed away from the door, my hands now trembling uncontrollably. The phone rang again. This time, I didn't hesitate. I picked it up quickly. "You shouldn't have looked," the voice said, its tone now dark, heavy with malice. I slammed the phone down, panic rising in my chest. Something wasn't right. There had been no one in the hallway moments ago. No one to leave that rose. A soft, almost imperceptible knock echoed through the door. I stepped back, my heart hammering. My body was frozen, every muscle screaming for me to move, but I couldn't. The knock came again, louder this time. Then the voice, barely a whisper but undeniably close. "I'm here." I stumbled backward, my legs barely holding me up. The walls seemed to close in. The room felt smaller, suffocating. The phone buzzed in my hand as it vibrated uncontrollably. My eyes darted to the window. The blinds were closed, but through the cracks, I saw a figure standing just outside, tall, shadowy, unmoving. The breath caught in my throat. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, but somehow I knew it was watching me. I turned away from the window, trembling, and backed toward the door, heart pounding in my ears. The knock came again, this time with force. The door handle began to turn. Slowly, deliberately. I ran. I bolted into the bathroom and locked the door, my pulse racing in my neck. I pressed my back against the cold tiles, breathing heavily, trying to control the panic. There was no way out, no escape. The phone buzzed again. The display flickered. I slowly reached for it, my hands shaking. I hesitated for a moment before answering. The voice on the other end was different now. Not the same eerie whisper, but clear, cold. "I'm inside," it said. I glanced around the small bathroom, eyes darting to the darkened corners. There was nowhere to hide. The door opened. The lights flickered. The figure stood in the doorway, face obscured by shadow. "I told you I could see you," the voice echoed. I dropped the phone as the lights went out completely, plunging me into pitch darkness. The air was thick and suffocating as I scrambled to move, to run, but something held me in place, paralyzed with terror. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything went silent. The figure, the voice, the phone calls, they all stopped. Never found out who had been calling or how they had gotten in. When I left the apartment the next morning, everything was exactly as it had been before, still untouched. But every night since then, I've heard that same voice again, whispering, "From the shadows, I can see you." It started on an ordinary Tuesday. I was house-sitting for an old friend, just a routine task. The house was in a quiet suburb, nothing unusual about it. My friend had asked me to stay for a few days while they were out of town, and the idea of having a large, empty house all to myself seemed like a peaceful escape from the usual noise of the city. The house wasn't particularly old, but it had a strange, faded charm. The walls were lined with family photos that had begun to yellow with age, and the faint scent of lavender lingered in the air. It was well kept, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. The silence was too heavy, too deliberate, as if the house was holding its breath. On the first night, I kept the lights on. The silence felt oppressive, and I couldn't bring myself to wander through the darkened hallways. But by the second night, curiosity got the better of me. The house felt strangely familiar, like I had been there before, though I knew I hadn't. As I roamed through the dimly lit rooms, I couldn't ignore the feeling that someone was watching me. Every corner I turned seemed just a little too shadowy. That's when I noticed the whispers. They started faint, barely audible, like they were carried on the wind. I figured it was just the house settling, but as the night wore on, the whispers grew louder. They seemed to come from the walls, but whenever I pressed my ear to them, they stopped. It was as if the house itself was trying to speak, only to fall silent when I paid attention. By the third night, the whispers had become impossible to ignore. They echoed through the house, now distinct words, soft, chilling, and indecipherable. I kept moving from room to room, but no matter how far I walked, they followed. It felt as though the house had come alive, consumed by some unseen force. Then, around midnight, the lights flickered and died. Panic shot through me as I realized the house was plunged into darkness. I fumbled for my phone to call for help, but my signal was gone. I was cut off from the world. Suddenly, I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate, echoing down the hallway. I stood frozen, my heart thudding in my chest. The footsteps weren't like any I'd ever heard. No one walks like that. It was as if whoever, or whatever, was making those sounds didn't have legs. The pacing grew louder, closer. Then a knock. Just one, but it wasn't at the door. Came from inside the walls. A hollow knock, repeated over and over as though someone was trapped behind them, trying to escape. My blood ran cold as I backed away, feeling trapped and surrounded by darkness. I didn't know how long I stood there. But soon, the whispers became more than just disembodied sounds. They were calling to me. They seemed to come from all around, each word spoken clearer than before. "Let us out," they pleaded. "Please, help us." In a moment of sheer terror, I bolted for the front door. I didn't care about the force keeping me there. I had to escape. But as I unlocked the door and pushed it open, I realized it wasn't my front door. The house I was standing in wasn't the one I had entered. I had stepped into a house identical to the one I had come from. Same layout, same old photos on the walls. But something was different. The air was colder, the silence deeper, and the whispers had followed me, now louder and more desperate. I didn't dare go back inside. Instead, I ran into the night, my breath clouding in the freezing air. The whispers still echo in my mind. Each word burned into my memory. And even though I made it out, I know the house isn't done with me. Sometimes I hear those whispers in my sleep. They're never far. They're still calling. We didn't know what we were walking into. The old apartment building stood in the heart of the city, a forgotten relic of a bygone era. The landlord had been eager to rent it out despite the whispers of its dark history. After months of searching for a place, we were desperate. It seemed like the perfect fit. The apartment itself was cramped, walls cracked with age, and a lingering musty smell that no amount of cleaning could eradicate. We didn't mind at first. Desperation had a way of dulling the senses. But as we settled in, things began to feel off. It started small. The lights flickered late at night, and the sound of footsteps echoed through the hallway, even though we knew no one else lived in the building. There were no neighbors to hear or investigate. Still, we chalked it up to old wiring or perhaps creaky floors settling over time. That's what we told ourselves. Then, the dreams began. Every night, the same dream. A dark figure standing at the edge of my bed, watching silently. Its presence filled the room, a heavy weight pressing down on my chest until I couldn't breathe. Every night, I woke up gasping, only to find the figure was gone, but the oppressive sensation lingered. One evening, Emma said something that froze me to the bone. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. We were sitting in the living room, the window partially open to let in the cool breeze. But beyond the glass there was a faint hum. Low, distorted, almost mechanical. It grew louder, closer, until the sound was overwhelming. It wasn't coming from outside, it seemed to be emanating from the walls themselves. "No," I said, shaking my head. "I didn't hear anything." Emma's eyes widened as she stared at me, her voice trembling. "It's getting louder. Listen." The hum became unbearable, like a malfunctioning machine deep within the building, something dark and twisted that shouldn't exist. We covered our ears, trying to block it out, but it felt like the sound was inside our very skulls, vibrating through our bones. Then came the whispers. Quiet at first, so soft that they seemed to drift in the corners of our minds. But soon, they morphed into full sentences, and they were speaking directly to us. "Get out." The voice wasn't just in our heads, it was in the room. I felt its breath on my neck, cold and sharp. It was close, too close. "Run," the voice said again, deeper this time, colder, more commanding. We tried to leave, but the door wouldn't open. The locks jammed, as if something unseen had seized control. The windows, once our only escape route, were shattered. Fragments of glass scattered across the floor. There was no way out. The whispers grew louder, overlapping now, filling the space until we couldn't think straight. They whispered of forgotten deeds, of souls trapped, unable to rest. The dark figure from my dreams materialized in the room, standing in front of us, its eyes empty, voids of darkness that devoured all light. "We're not alone," Emma whispered, her voice quivering. The figure stepped closer, and we could feel its chilling presence. The air grew colder, too cold. Every breath we took was like inhaling ice. My hands trembled uncontrollably as I stared into its lifeless eyes. "We don't belong here," Ryan said, his voice strained. The entity tilted its head, an unnatural movement before it spoke again, its voice weaving between us like a dark web. Escape is futile. Desperation surged through us. I shouted, screaming into the void, but the whispers swallowed my voice. Emma clawed at the walls, desperate to tear through them, while Ryan pounded on the windows, even as shards cut into his hands. But nothing worked. The presence only grew stronger. Suddenly, as if waking from a nightmare, the hum stopped. The whispers ceased. The dark figure blinked once, its eyes flickering as if coming to consciousness. The entire apartment fell silent. We didn't waste a second. Without speaking, we bolted through the hallway, shoving open doors, desperate for any exit. And there it was, a small back staircase hidden in the shadows. We fled down it, falling over each other in our haste, ignoring the burning in our legs. At the bottom, we burst into the alley, breathless and alive. The city seemed normal again. Noise, light, movement. But we didn't stop. We kept running, heart pounding in sync with the chaos that had just unfolded. When we dared to look back, the building was empty, still and undisturbed, like it had never happened. No signs of life, no trace of the horrors we experienced. We never spoke of what had transpired that night again. The apartment had become our shared nightmare, something too impossible to comprehend, let alone explain. To this day, we avoid that part of the city. We don't know what still lingers there, and honestly, we don't want to find out. It was just another late shift at the old office building. I worked as a security guard, tasked with patrolling the vast, dimly lit halls of a towering skyscraper in the middle of the city. The building had been empty for years, its windows dark and vacant. My shift started at midnight, and the solitude was always oppressive. I was used to the silence, but tonight felt different. The city was distant, barely visible beyond the thick glass of the high-rise. No cars passed, no lights flickered in the surrounding streets. It was as if the entire world had gone to sleep. I checked my phone. No signal. The usual hum of the city had faded completely. Around 1 a.m., something changed. I heard it first, a iki, faint whisper carried through the air like a sigh. I froze. It was faint, almost indistinguishable from the sound of the ventilation system, but it wasn't coming from the usual source. The whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, echoing off the empty office walls as if they were coming from inside the building itself. At first, I assumed it was just the building settling, but the voices didn't seem to belong to any natural source. They were disjointed, fractured, as if they were fragments of conversations I couldn't understand. I strained to make out the words, but they blurred together into an incomprehensible murmur. Around 2 a.m., the lights flickered. Just once. A sharp, sudden blink that cast everything into eerie shadows. It lasted only a second, but the sensation it left behind lingered. I knew I was alone in the building, yet the air seemed thick, like something or someone was watching me from the corners of the rooms. The whispers turned darker. They weren't whispers anymore. They were voices, distorted and echoing, rising from the shadows that lined the hallways. They called out to me. Not with words, but with sounds too inhuman to recognize. My heart pounded, but I couldn't move. I stood frozen as they swirled around me, more insistent, more real than they had been just moments before. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks, but something felt wrong. I checked the security cameras. The building appeared empty, but the static on the monitors wasn't just visual. It felt alive. A dark shape lingered at the edge of the screen, something that wasn't supposed to be there. I stared harder, but the image flickered and vanished. The whispers turned to laughter, cold, hollow laughter that seemed to come from all around me. I covered my ears, but it was inside my head now. The walls seemed to pulse, vibrating with the unnatural sound. My breath came shallow, and I realized I wasn't breathing properly. Suddenly, I heard a soft, deliberate knock on the office door. A single knock. I jerked around, my pulse racing. The building had no one but me. Yet I knew someone, or something, was on the other side. Another knock, louder this time. I stumbled toward the door, my mind screaming to get away, but my legs refused to move. The whispers grew deafening, echoing through my skull. "Run!" they hissed. Tears blurred my vision as I reached out for the door handle. My fingers trembled, and as I turned it, I felt a chill seep through my palm. The door swung open, and there was nothing but darkness beyond. I hesitated, heart pounding in my chest. A breath escaped me, ragged and trembling. The hallway was empty. No one was there. Yet, I knew. I knew they were watching from the void. I slammed the door shut and didn't stop running. I left the building and didn't look back, not until I was far from that cursed place. The whispers still haunt me, still echo in my mind, in quiet moments when I think I'm alone. I survived that night, but something followed me. Something isn't finished yet. It was supposed to be a simple day at the park, nothing unusual. Just me, my camera, and a quiet trail leading into the woods. I've always been fond of nature and spent my weekends hiking or exploring different paths, searching for something unique to capture on film. That morning, I packed my camera gear and set out early. The air was crisp and the sun was barely peeking over the horizon when I arrived at the trailhead. It was a familiar spot, but this time something felt off. The usual sounds of chirping birds and rustling leaves were missing. Instead, there was silence, the kind that hangs heavy, as if the world itself had gone still. I took a deep breath and shrugged it off, telling myself I was imagining things. As I followed the trail deeper into the woods, the quiet only grew. The trees seemed taller, the shadows stretching unnaturally long. The path became narrower, winding between thick undergrowth. I kept walking, ignoring the unease growing in my chest. At one point, I stopped to take a photo. I raised my camera and glanced through the lens. What I saw wasn't the usual forest scene. There was something there, something moving just beyond, the edge of the frame. A figure, tall and obscured by the trees, watching me. My hands shook as I lowered the camera, but when I looked, there was nothing there. I kept moving, trying to push the thought away, but every step felt heavier. The Uitik trail began to thin, and the trees loomed larger, as if they were closing in on me. I glanced behind, but all I could see was the empty path I had come from. I walked until I reached a small clearing, bathed in the dim light filtering through the canopy. It was peaceful, the kind of moment you wish could last forever. But something about the stillness unsettled me. I felt like I was being watched. I set my camera down on a rock and took a seat, staring at the trees that surrounded me. Then I noticed something. A faint whisper, almost inaudible. I strained my ears, but the sound was gone. I told myself it was just the wind, until it came again, louder this time. Not quite a whisper, not quite a voice, but something close enough to make my skin crawl. I grabbed my camera and began to snap pictures, hoping to capture whatever it was. The shutter clicked again and again, but when I reviewed the images, there was nothing but the forest. A rustling noise came from behind, and I turned sharply, expecting to see an animal. Instead, there was nothing, just the trees, still and unmoving. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized I was alone. Or so I thought. I heard it again. Closer this time. The faint sound of footsteps crunching leaves. I turned slowly, my camera raised, but there was still nothing in sight. The sound continued, steady and deliberate, circling the clearing. Panic surged through me as I realized I wasn't imagining it. The footsteps weren't from an animal. They were from something else. I stumbled backward, keeping my eyes on the trees, my breath coming in ragged gasps. And then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it. A figure, tall and shadowy, moving between the trees. Its form was distorted, barely human, but I could feel its presence. Its eyes, if it even had them, were black voids, staring straight at me. I turned and ran. My legs carried me faster than I thought possible. The sound of those footsteps growing louder behind me. The trees blurred into streaks of green and brown, but I didn't dare stop. My camera swung wildly as I pushed through thorns and branches, the fear coursing through me like electricity. When I finally broke free from the trees, I didn't stop to look back. I ran to my car, throwing open the door and slamming it shut. Behind me, the silence of the forest was replaced by the steady hum of the engine, but the feeling of being watched didn't fade. I sat there, hands trembling on the steering wheel, staring at the woods. The figure, whatever it was, had disappeared, but I knew it was still out there, waiting just beyond my sight. The summer evening was warm, the kind of heat that lingers even as the sun dips below the horizon. We decided to go on a hike that day, something none of us had done in a while. There were 5 of us, old friends, eager to reconnect and enjoy the fresh air. The trail led us deep into the woods, far from any signs of civilization. The trees loomed overhead, their thick canopies blocking most of the sunlight, leaving the forest in a perpetual shade. It was peaceful, almost too quiet. The only sound was the crunch of leaves beneath our boots and the occasional rustling of branches. We hadn't seen another person since we parked the car hours ago. The isolation felt serene, almost perfect. But something felt off. It wasn't, until we were several miles into the hike that I noticed it. The trees started feeling closer together, the trail growing narrower. It wasn't just the forest pressing in. The atmosphere felt heavier, like something was watching us from the shadows. I brushed it off at first. Maybe the isolation was starting to get to me. But then, one by one, the others began to notice it too. The silence wasn't just peaceful anymore, it was oppressive. My friend Sarah stopped suddenly, turning to the rest of us with wide eyes. "Do you feel that?" she asked, her voice trembling. We all nodded, uneasy now. The air felt colder, the trees rustling more erratically. It was as if the forest had taken on a life of its own. My other friend, Jack, pulled out his phone, checking for signal, but there was nothing. Not even a faint bar. "Let's keep going," I suggested, trying to stay calm. But deep down, I knew we shouldn't have. As we pressed forward, the forest seemed to tighten its grip. The trail became harder to follow, winding, deeper into the unknown. The trees grew taller, their branches reaching out like clawed fingers. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us, something that didn't belong in the woods. It was when we came to a clearing that things took a darker turn. The trees around us seemed to hum with an unnatural energy, their shadows shifting in ways that defied the laws of light. In the center of the clearing was an old, weathered wooden bench, completely out of place. The air felt even colder now, and I could see my breath in front of me, though it wasn't that cold. "Let's sit for a minute," someone suggested, and we all hesitated but agreed. The bench creaked as we sat down, its splinters digging into my legs. It felt ancient, like it had been there long before any of us. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, something out of the corner of my eye. But when I turned, I saw it more clearly. A figure stood at the edge of the clearing, cloaked in shadows. I couldn't make out any features, only the impression of something tall and gaunt. "Who's there?" Jack called out, his voice cracking. But there was no response. The figure didn't move. It simply stood there, watching. "Guys, we need to go," Sarah said, panic creeping into her voice. The rest of us didn't argue. We grabbed our things and started walking quickly, keeping our eyes fixed ahead, but the feeling of being followed didn't leave. The figure was still there, always just out of reach. Every time we looked back, it seemed closer, as though it was always trailing us. We didn't stop again, even as night began to fall. The forest grew darker, but the figure stayed with us, a constant, silent presence. Eventually, we stumbled out of the woods, back to the car. We didn't speak much on the drive home, each of us lost in our thoughts. It wasn't until the next day that I looked back at the photos I took on the hike. One picture caught my attention: the clearing, the old bench, and in the background, faint and distorted, was that figure. Its eyes were the only thing visible, hollow and empty, staring back at me. It was supposed to be a relaxing trip. A few friends and I decided to escape the city and spend a weekend camping at a secluded lake in the mountains. None of us had been there before, but we'd heard it was quiet, beautiful, and perfect for getting away from the noise of the world. We arrived late in the afternoon, the sun sinking low behind the trees as we parked our cars by the edge of the lake. The water was calm, its surface reflecting the pale light of dusk like a mirror. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. For a moment, everything felt perfect. We set up our tents, gathered wood for a fire, and cooked dinner. The laughter and conversation filled the space, muffled by the stillness of the woods. It was everything we had hoped for: peaceful, remote, and disconnected from the chaos of daily life. As night fell, we gathered around the fire, watching the flames flicker and listening to the quiet crackling. The stars appeared, one by one, stretching out into the endless dark sky. The lake reflected them, making it seem as though we were surrounded by an ocean of light. But it wasn't the beauty that started to unsettle me. It was the silence. No wind rustled the trees. No insects chirped, just the crackling fire and the faint sound of water lapping at the shore. It was too quiet, unnatural. I glanced around at my friends who were deep in conversation, unaware of the strange stillness. "I'm going to get some water," one of them finally said, breaking the silence. "Sure," I replied, trying to sound nonchalant. "I'll come with." We made our way to the edge of the lake, our footsteps silent on the soft earth. The water was cold and still, reflecting the dark shapes of the trees. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us, waiting. "Hey," I whispered to my friend. "Do you feel that?" He stopped, looking at me, his face pale under the starlight. "Yeah, something's not right." We stood there for a moment, our eyes scanning the darkness beyond the trees. There was no movement, no sound, just the stillness. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it. A faint shimmer, like something just beneath the surface of the water. A reflection that wasn't quite right. I turned toward it, heart racing, and saw a figure. It wasn't human, at least not entirely. Its form was indistinct, almost fluid, as though it was made of the water itself. It stared at us with hollow eyes, its face obscured by the darkness. I grabbed my friend's arm, my voice trembling. "We need to get back." We ran. Our footsteps thundered in my ears as we sprinted back to the campsite. The trees loomed over us, their branches creaking as if they were watching us too. The fire was still burning, casting flickering shadows on my friends' faces, but none of them seemed to notice our panic. That night, I couldn't sleep. The silence that had once felt peaceful now felt suffocating. I kept hearing whispers in the dark, and every time I closed my eyes I saw the figure, those hollow, watching eyes beneath the water. At dawn, I gathered my friends and told them what had happened. They didn't believe me. They dismissed it as nerves, as the strange atmosphere of the woods playing tricks on my mind. But I knew better. The figure was still out there, waiting beneath the surface of the lake, and I could still feel those hollow eyes watching me, even now. I'll never forget the day I visited that old bookstore. It was tucked away on a quiet street, surrounded by tall, crumbling brick buildings that leaned toward one another as though the city had forgotten about them. The windows of the bookstore were dusty and covered in fog, but something about it drew me in. It wasn't the kind of place people normally wandered into, but I found myself stepping through the creaking wooden door without hesitation. The bell above rang faintly, and the smell of old paper and dust hit me all at once. The place felt as though it had been untouched for decades. Bookshelves stretched high above my head, the spines old and faded. The light from the single bulb overhead flickered weakly. I wandered through the narrow aisles, trailing my fingers along the spines of the forgotten books, half expecting to hear the whispers of some long-lost ghostly stories. I picked up a few, old paperbacks, flipping through pages that crinkled in my hands. Something about the silence and the musty air felt almost otherworldly. I lost track of time, losing myself in the thick atmosphere of the store. At the end of one aisle, I found a shelf that seemed different from the rest. The books here were thinner, almost like pamphlets, their covers dark and worn. I pulled one from the shelf. Its title was barely legible. Whispers of the Forgotten. It wasn't the title that caught my attention, though. It was the strange sense of familiarity I felt as I opened it. The first few pages were scattered with strange symbols and text I couldn't read. I traced my fingers over them, my mind drawn to the obscure illustrations, twisted, distorted shapes that looked like they were from another world. I turned to the next page, and that's when I saw it. Words written in a language that wasn't English. They weren't letters, just strange symbols that sent a shiver down my spine. I couldn't stop reading, as though something was compelling me to continue. My hands trembled as I read the first few lines. Those who seek will find, but they may not return. The words sent a cold wave through my body. I glanced around the bookstore, suddenly realizing how quiet it had become. The faint creak of the floorboards seemed to echo louder than it should have, and I could feel eyes on me. It was as though the store itself was watching, waiting. The room seemed darker now, shadows stretching toward me from the corners of the shelves. My heart raced as I looked back at the book. The pages turned by themselves, landing on a chapter that spoke of places that no longer existed. Forgotten towns, cities swallowed by time and silence. The more I read, the more I felt an odd connection to these places. It was as if I had been there before, even though I knew I hadn't. Suddenly, the light overhead flickered violently, casting everything into near darkness. A chill swept through the room, and I heard a whisper, so faint I could barely make it out. "Turn back." I froze, the whisper echoing in my ears. My eyes darted around the bookstore, but there was no one there. My breath came in shallow gasps as I realized I was alone. The pages of the book flipped again, this time stopping on a section titled The Forgotten Path. My hands were shaking as I read, "The path is long and lonely, but those who seek will find. Beware, for what is lost may never be reclaimed." The room felt colder now, and I could hear the sound of footsteps, though no one was there. The air was thick, and it felt as though something was closing in on me. I wanted to leave, but I couldn't move. My body felt frozen, my mind consumed by the words of the book. It was then that I noticed something at the edge of my vision. A figure, tall, shadowy, and indistinct, stood at the end of the aisle, watching me. I couldn't make out its face, but I could feel its presence. It wasn't human, not in the way I knew. The whisper came again, clearer this time. "Return. What is lost?" Panic set in, and I knew I had to get out. I stumbled backward, clutching the book tightly. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its gaze following me as I hurried toward the door. As I ran out of the bookstore, the bell above rang once more, echoing into the night. I didn't look back. The streets outside were empty, silent, as though the city had swallowed the bookstore whole. I don't know what I brought with me from that place, but every night since I've dreamed of the figures and the whispers. There's a piece of that book still in my hands, and I wonder, will I ever be able to forget, or will I be drawn back seeking something I might not want to find? It was just another evening walk through the woods, like countless others I'd taken before. My friends and I had made a habit of these late-night strolls, always curious about what lay beyond the edge of town. The woods were familiar to us, comforting even, filled with tall trees and the rustling of leaves. But that night was different. We set out just after dusk, the golden glow of the sunset fading behind us. The air was cool, crisp, and the distant sounds of traffic seemed to fade away as we ventured deeper into the trees. The woods were quiet, too quiet. There was no laughter, no chirping of crickets, just silence. It wasn't the usual peaceful quiet, though. It felt wrong. We walked on, joking and laughing, trying to shake off the oppressive atmosphere, but something was off. something I couldn't quite place. My friends seemed oblivious, lost in their chatter, but I felt the weight of the forest pressing down on me. As we pushed further, we came across an old, decaying wooden bench, rotted and covered in moss. It wasn't there on our previous walks, that much I was sure of. We decided to stop for a moment, stretching our legs, as if the bench had appeared there just for us. I sat down, resting my hands on my knees. The silence felt heavier now. I looked around, but there was no sign of the familiar paths we usually walked. The trees felt tighter, as if the woods were closing in. My stomach twisted. "I think we should head back," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. One of my friends, Jake, waved me off. "Come on, what's the rush? We've been here a dozen times, there's nothing different." But I wasn't so sure. Something wasn't right. We continued walking, though my steps grew slower. The woods seemed to stretch endlessly, and the usual landmarks, the twisted old tree, the hollowed-out log, were nowhere to be found. It was as if the forest had shifted, or we had. Then came the first sound that shattered the silence, a faint echoing whisper that seemed to drift through the trees. It was so soft I almost convinced myself I imagined it. But then, there it was again, a whisper, distant yet near, as though it was calling to me. I stopped, heart racing. My friends turned to look at me, their faces a mix of curiosity and concern. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Hear what?" one of them replied, their tone dismissive. I shook my head, forcing a laugh. "Never mind, let's just keep going." We pressed on, but the whispers grew louder, closer. They weren't coming from any one direction. They seemed to drift around us as if carried by the very trees themselves. The shadows deepened, casting the woods in an eerie glow. Then I saw it. A figure emerged from the trees, pale and gaunt, its features obscured by the fading light. At first, I thought it was one of my friends playing a trick. But this figure didn't walk like a person. Its movements were unnatural, jerky and slow, as though it didn't belong to the world we knew. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The figure turned its hollow gaze towards me. Its eyes, if they could be called eyes, were dark and empty, like voids of nothingness. "Run," I managed to whisper. But before I could move, my friends stood frozen, transfixed by the figure. I screamed at them to move, but they didn't respond. They were still, staring at the figure like they couldn't look away. The whispers grew louder, overlapping, and I could feel something shift in the air around me. The figure stepped closer, its movements like something out of a nightmare. I backed away, heart pounding in my chest, but my feet wouldn't move, as if the ground itself was holding me in place. Then, from the corner of my eye, I noticed something. The trees weren't trees anymore. They were faces. Hundreds, thousands of hollow, empty faces staring back at me from the darkness. Their mouths were open, whispering, calling out in that haunting, otherworldly language. The figure stepped closer, and I could feel its presence pressing against my skin, colder than anything I had ever known. Its breath was a chill, a void of nothingness that seemed to consume everything around me. I could hear my friends murmuring, lost in the whispers of the forest, their eyes wide but unseeing. I was alone now, standing amidst the forest that had become a sea of emptiness, the faces of the trees watching me, waiting. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The whispers filled my ears, louder and louder, until they became all I could hear. And then there was silence. It was a quiet evening, and I had decided to go for a walk in the old neighborhood park that bordered the edge of town. The park wasn't particularly large, but it had always felt familiar, almost like a second home growing up. The trees were tall and ancient, their twisted branches stretching across the paths, casting long shadows as the sun dipped below the horizon. It had been years since I last wandered through these trails, but I always felt drawn back whenever I needed space to think. As I walked deeper into the park, the air grew cooler. the rustling leaves crunching softly beneath my feet. There were hardly any other people around, which only added to the sense of solitude. I wasn't expecting to encounter anyone. The park was rarely crowded during the evening hours. I figured it would be a peaceful walk, perfect to clear my head after a long day. I passed a small, decrepit wooden bench half buried beneath overgrown vines. It was an old fixture from the days of my childhood. I paused for a moment, staring at the faded graffiti that had long since been swallowed by moss. The bench felt like a quiet witness to countless secrets from the past, memories of old friendships and whispered promises. As I continued along the trail, I noticed the faint sound of running water. A small creek weaved its way through the park, barely noticeable until now. The gentle babble of the stream was oddly calming, and I decided to follow its course. The path led me to a clearing, where the creek widened into a shallow pool surrounded by tall, leafy trees. The sunset painted the water in hues of amber and gold, reflecting the serene beauty of the surroundings. I sat down by the edge, my feet dipping into the cool, clear water. The sound of the water lapping against the rocks was soothing. I lost track of time, simply sitting there, letting my thoughts wander. The tension from earlier in the day seemed to melt away, replaced by an eerie stillness. There was no breeze, no rustling of leaves, just an unnatural silence that seemed almost too quiet. Suddenly, from deep within the trees, I heard a whisper. It was faint at first, almost like the wind shifting through the leaves. But as I strained to listen, the whispers became clearer, more distinct. "I'm here." The words were barely more than a breath, carried by the faint breeze. My heart jolted. I glanced around, expecting to see someone emerging from the trees, but the clearing remained empty. I told myself it was just my imagination playing tricks. The park was known for its stillness, for its isolated atmosphere. Maybe it was just the wind, bending the branches and creating phantom sounds. Still, the voice echoed in my head. "I'm here. Please, stay." My pulse quickened and I stood up, backing away from the water's edge. The feeling of being watched returned, pressing down on me like a weight. I could feel something. Something was there, hidden just beyond the trees. I turned and began walking quickly toward the trail. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, like they were moving closer. Each step I took sent chills down my spine. Then, just as I reached the edge of the trees, I felt it. A cold, bony hand grasping at my arm. I froze, unable to move, my breath hitching in my throat. I could feel the cold of its touch, something impossibly dry and lifeless. "I told you." "Stay," the voice whispered again, right next to my ear this time. The air seemed to vibrate around me, thick and suffocating. Tears stung my eyes as I fought the rising panic. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body refused to respond. The grip tightened, and I felt a chill crawl up my spine. "Don't leave," the voice continued, quieter this time, almost desperate. "You can't." Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the grip released. I staggered back, my heart pounding, and ran as fast as I could toward the distant glow of the city. I haven't been back to that park since. And every night when I close my eyes, I still hear the whispers, soft and haunting, reminding me that whatever was there is still waiting. It started on a warm summer evening. I decided to take a long walk through a park near my apartment. It wasn't particularly special, just one of those city parks with paved paths, trees, and a small pond that people like to visit on weekends. I wasn't expecting much, just some fresh air and a bit of peace. As I walked, the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows from the trees. The place was mostly deserted, save for a few scattered families and couples enjoying the cool evening. I passed a group of kids playing near the pond, their laughter echoing off the water. It was peaceful, almost serene, and I welcomed the quiet. I hadn't wandered far when I noticed something strange. A bench further along the path was occupied by a figure sitting completely still. At first, I thought nothing of it. Maybe someone deep in thought, taking a moment to rest. But as I got closer, I saw that there was no movement, no indication that they were alive. I stopped a few paces away, studying them from a distance. The figure was slouched forward, their head bowed as if lost in thought. But something wasn't right. Their posture wasn't relaxed. It was unnatural. They sat there, motionless, not responding to the world around them. Even the gentle evening breeze seemed to avoid disturbing them. I stood there, unsure whether to approach. Something felt off, like they were not supposed to be there. Slowly, I took a step closer, my breath coming a little quicker. The closer I got, the more I realized that the figure wasn't breathing. I froze. My mind raced as I tried to rationalize what I was seeing. Maybe they were asleep, but how could they sit like that, so completely still? I glanced around, trying to gather my thoughts. There were no signs of life anywhere nearby. I felt an overwhelming sense of dread, as though I had stepped into a world that wasn't meant for me. My instinct was to leave, but something held me there, rooted to the spot. A quiet voice in my head told me to stay, that I couldn't just walk away from this. I stepped closer, my breath shallow as I tried to make out any detail, anything that could tell me they were alive. That's when I saw it. The face, pale, void of any expression. It wasn't the stillness that terrified me most, but the eyes. They were open, but they didn't reflect light, didn't seem to see. There was no life behind them, only emptiness. I took another hesitant step forward, my heart pounding harder now. The figure didn't move. I reached out slowly, trembling fingers brushing against the arm. It was cold, unnaturally cold, like they had been there for ages. Terror surged through me, but before I could turn and run, a faint whisper reached my ears, barely audible above the silence. It was a voice, hollow and distant. "Don't leave." I spun around, but there was no one there. The park was still empty, the fading light of the sun casting long shadows. I looked back at the figure whose gaze seemed to follow me as I backed away. With every step, I felt as though something was pulling at me, drawing me closer again. I forced myself to turn and run, my legs carrying me away from the figure, from the park, from whatever had been watching me. When I finally stopped to catch my breath, the park was silent again. No sign of the figure, no echo of the voice, only the fading hum of the city in the distance. I didn't go back to that park, and to this day I can't shake the feeling that I wasn't supposed to leave. I don't remember exactly when I noticed something strange. It wasn't a specific moment, more like a slow, creeping feeling that followed me for days. I was spending a week at my family's lake house, a place we've always gone to relax. Nothing special, just a quiet cabin on the edge of a still lake surrounded by forest. The first few days were peaceful, just me and my parents. We spent our time fishing, hiking, and reading. The lake was calm and the forest stretched endlessly around us. I figured it was just one of those perfect summer trips where nothing goes wrong. But then the dreams started. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, soaked in sweat, my heart pounding. The dreams weren't anything like the usual ones. No monsters, no shadows lurking in the dark. It was more like silence. A deep, oppressive silence that felt too heavy to breathe in. The forest, the lake, it was all too quiet. I could hear my own breathing and nothing else. No crickets, no rustling leaves, no waves lapping at the shore. Just a complete void of sound. The third night, it happened again. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just the quiet surroundings messing with my head. I got out of bed and stepped onto the small porch, hoping a breath of fresh air would clear my mind. But as soon as I stepped outside, I felt it. Something wasn't right. The lake, usually serene and reflective, had become unsettlingly still. I sat down on the porch, staring at the water, listening to the echo of my thoughts. Then I noticed something. The surface of the lake wasn't calm anymore. It had started to ripple. Not from any wind, but from something beneath it. At first, I thought maybe it was just a fish or some animal moving through the water, but the ripples weren't natural. They formed a pattern, slow and deliberate. A figure, faint and shadowy, began to emerge beneath the surface. I froze. The figure didn't resemble a person. It was long, distorted, its limbs unnaturally elongated, moving like it was struggling to pull itself from the depths. Its eyes, if they could even be called that, were hollow and dark, like the void beneath the water. I couldn't look away. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't move. The figure seemed to glide toward me, its movements unnatural, like something from a dream, too wrong to be real. I could feel its gaze, even though it had no visible face. I couldn't comprehend what I was seeing, but I knew it wasn't something human. Then it vanished. The water grew calm again. I blinked, not sure if what I had seen was real. The air felt heavy, and I sat there for what felt like hours, too afraid to move. Eventually, I forced myself back inside, locking every door and window. The next morning, my parents woke me up as if nothing had happened. The sun was shining, and everything seemed normal. We went about our day, fishing, laughing, trying to forget about the quiet nights. But I knew deep down that something had changed. It's been years since that trip, but I still visit the lake house. The dreams haven't stopped, and sometimes in the stillness of the night, I wonder if I'll see that figure again, waiting beneath the surface, watching. It was supposed to be a quiet trip to the lake, just a few friends and I, escaping the city for the weekend. The plan was simple: set up camp by the water, fish, and relax under the stars. No cell service, no distractions, just nature. I had been looking forward to it, needing the break from the noise of everyday life. We drove deep into the forest, following the narrow, winding path that led to our campsite. The trees stretched endlessly on either side of us, their thick canopies blocking out the sun. It was peaceful, serene. We found a spot right by the edge of the lake, unpacked and set up our tents. As the sun began to dip behind the trees, we built a fire, roasting marshmallows and enjoying the quiet. Night fell quickly, the lake reflecting the faint glow of the crescent moon. We sat around the fire, telling stories and laughing. It was as perfect as I had imagined. But then the noises started. At first, it was faint, barely noticeable, a soft, echoing hum, as if the forest itself was breathing. I mentioned it to my friends, but they waved it off, saying it was probably just the wind through the trees. I wasn't so sure. The sound didn't seem natural, and the longer we listened, the more it felt like it was growing closer. Eventually, we all fell silent. The hum had turned into something more distinct, a series of low, guttural whispers. I strained to hear what they were saying, but they were too faint, too distorted. It felt as though they were coming from the trees, surrounding us, but there was no one there. One of my friends, Mark, stood up abruptly and walked toward the edge of the campsite. "It's nothing," he muttered, his voice shaky. "Just the forest playing tricks." But I could see the tension in his shoulders. The whispers hadn't stopped. If anything, they were louder now, more distinct. And then there was a sound that made my blood run cold. A faint scratching. Not from the trees or the ground, but from inside the forest itself. It was like something was clawing its way closer, scraping against the bark. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice trembling. Mark didn't answer. He was frozen, staring at the trees like he'd seen a ghost. And then it happened. A figure stepped out from the shadows. It wasn't human, not entirely. Its form was thin and gaunt, almost skeletal, but its face was obscured by darkness. No features, no eyes, just emptiness. It moved toward us, its steps slow and deliberate, as if it didn't belong in this world. The whispers had become screams now, piercing and agonized. I could feel my heart racing, my body frozen in place. My friends were shouting, but the sound of their voices barely registered. The figure was getting closer, the scratching louder, almost as if it were dragging itself through the trees. And then, just as suddenly as it appeared, the figure stopped. It stood there, maybe a few feet away, completely still. I couldn't move, couldn't look away. The whispers had stopped too, replaced by an unbearable silence that felt like it was suffocating us. The air grew colder, heavy, almost suffocating. I could see my breath in the night. Then, from behind us, another sound, the faintest rustle of footsteps. Not from the figure, but from the trees. Something was circling us, moving through the shadows. Panic surged through me, and without thinking, I grabbed Mark's arm and pulled him toward the fire. My friends followed, and we stumbled over each other, rushing back to our tents. The whispers were now screams, the rustling footsteps growing louder, echoing through the trees. We didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the trees, every whisper in the dark sent shivers down our spines. Whatever had come for us wasn't leaving. The forest wasn't quiet anymore. It was alive. In the morning, we packed up and left as quickly as we could. The whispers, the figure, the scratching, all of it had vanished by sunrise. But the fear hadn't. To this day, I wonder what we encountered that night. Some part of me still expects to hear those whispers, see that figure wherever I go. And deep down, I know we weren't alone out there. It started with a simple trip. Me and a few friends decided to rent a small lake house nestled deep in the woods. We were looking for a peaceful weekend away from the noise of city life. The house was old, wooden, surrounded by towering pines and the quiet hum of nature. We thought it would be perfect. Serene, isolated, and far from any distractions. The first night was calm. We unpacked, had a few drinks, and sat by the fire. The lake, reflecting the full moon, seemed endless and still. The wind whispered through the trees, and I could almost feel the tension from the city melt away. It felt too quiet, though, unnervingly so. But we brushed it off, telling ourselves it was just the stillness of the woods at night. It was around midnight when I woke. I'd drifted off in one of the old wooden chairs by the window. Something stirred in my dream. I sat up and rubbed my eyes. The fire had died down to glowing embers, and the room was cast in darkness. That's when I heard it. Soft tapping. I assumed it was rain, but the sky was clear. The sound came again. Light, but deliberate, like something was trying to get my attention. I turned my head toward the window, listening, expecting to see raindrops. But there was nothing there. I waited, my breath shallow, listening for whatever could be making the noise. Then, through the corner of my eye, I saw something move. Not a shadow, not a figure. It was a shape, indistinct, something that seemed out of place. I froze. My heart pounded as I scanned the dark outline of the woods outside. The trees seemed to stretch endlessly, their tops swaying in the wind. Whatever was there wasn't a part of the forest. It felt like it didn't belong. I got up slowly, every step creaking on the old wooden floor. The tapping continued, but now it wasn't just at the window. It was all around the house, soft, rhythmic, almost musical. I peered out again, my eyes straining into the night. There, in the distance, I saw it, just for a second. A figure, not human, not quite. It was tall, thin, and it moved strangely, almost like a distorted reflection of something. I stumbled backward, my hand gripping the wall. My mind raced. Was it a trick of the light? Was I imagining things? But the fear was too real. Something wasn't right. The tapping stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. I wanted to call out to my friends, but my voice wouldn't work. The air felt colder, like something had seeped into the house. Then I heard it, the voice. Soft, almost a whisper, but it carried through the room like it was right next to me. Come outside. It wasn't coming from anywhere in the house. It was outside. The chill in my bones deepened. I felt like I was frozen, rooted to the floor. I wanted to scream, but all I could do was listen. The door creaked open on its own. I didn't remember leaving it unlocked. The figure I had seen before was now closer, just beyond the porch. It wasn't moving, just standing there, watching the house. I wanted to run, but I couldn't. My legs felt like stone. The whisper came again, sharper this time. "Let me in." I blinked, trying to comprehend what I was seeing. The figure took a step closer. It was unnatural, wrong. Its skin was pale and stretched too thin, and its limbs moved like they weren't quite attached to its body. Panic surged through me. I forced myself to turn and sprint toward my friends' rooms. The taps on the window started again, louder, as if they were chasing me. I could feel something behind me, something that wanted to get in. I burst into their room, screaming, and dragged them from their beds. They were groggy at first, but the fear in my voice made them realize something wasn't right. We rushed out the back door, not daring to look back. The figure never followed us. We left the cabin behind, not stopping until we reached the edge of the woods where we could no longer see the house. It wasn't until hours later, as we sat in a diner miles from where we started, that I finally spoke. "I think we were followed," I said, my voice trembling. "I think something was waiting for us. None of us wanted to go back. None of us ever did." It was a quiet evening when my friends and I decided to take a drive out into the hills. We weren't exactly sure where we were going, but that was part of the appeal. Just aimlessly exploring, watching the sunset over the valley, letting the world slip away. The winding road stretched ahead, surrounded by thick woods on either side. We were laughing, joking about nothing in particular, when we came across a narrow dirt path that cut off from the main road. It wasn't marked, barely noticeable, but curiosity got the best of us. "Let's see where it goes," one of my friends said, turning onto the path. The trees grew thicker as we followed the trail, the sun dipping lower on the horizon. The deeper we drove, the quieter it became. The only sound the crunching of gravel beneath the tires. The woods seemed to close in around us, shadows creeping longer as the light faded. After what felt like miles, we came across an old, decrepit cabin. Its roof sagged, windows shattered, and the door hung ajar like something had long since abandoned it. The sight of it sent a chill down my spine. We stopped the car and got out, drawn by some strange compulsion. The air was still, heavy with the scent of decay. The cabin stood there, a relic from a forgotten past, like it had been waiting for us to find it. The three of us hesitated, but something about the silence and the sense of isolation pulled us closer. Inside, it was colder than outside. Dust covered everything, and the faint smell of mildew hung in the air. Old furniture lay overturned, forgotten and broken. It was as though no one had been here in decades. My friends and I moved cautiously, shining our flashlights into the corners of the cabin, peering through the debris. Then we heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, like someone dragging their feet across the floorboards. It wasn't coming from outside. It was inside the cabin. We froze, our breath catching in our throats. The cabin was small, too small for someone to be hiding. We had checked the whole place, every room, yet those footsteps kept moving, circling us, echoing louder as they drew closer. Panic set in. My friends were shouting, trying to make sense of it, but I was rooted to the spot. The light from my flashlight flickered, casting shadows that seemed to twist and bend unnaturally. Then I saw it. A figure standing in the doorway. It was tall, impossibly thin, and its face was obscured by darkness. No eyes, no features, just a void where the face should have been. It moved closer, the footsteps still echoing, but now they were slower, more deliberate. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The thing didn't seem to notice us, as if we were invisible. It reached out, its long, bony fingers brushing against the doorframe, and then it simply disappeared. We didn't stay. We couldn't. My friends and I ran back to the car, not looking back, the silence of the woods pressing down on us as we tore down the path. The strange figure, whatever it was, had vanished, but the fear it left behind lingered, hanging in the air like a bad dream. Even now, I can't forget the stillness of the woods, the hollow echo of those footsteps, and the figure that no one could explain. Some things don't need answers to be terrifying. It was a lazy Sunday afternoon when I decided to explore the old deserted factory on the outskirts of town. I'd always been fascinated by abandoned places, the rusted machinery, the echoing silence. There was something eerie about them, like the memories of what once thrived inside lingered, waiting to be disturbed. The factory was massive, with crumbling walls and broken windows letting in streaks of sunlight. Most of the machinery was old and covered in dust, but it was still intact enough to give me a glimpse of what it must have been like in its prime. I wandered through the halls, the sound of my footsteps echoing off the empty concrete. At first, everything seemed normal, almost serene, but there was a subtle, underlying feeling of tension. It felt like I wasn't alone, though I couldn't hear or see anyone. My heart picked up a little, but I brushed it off. Abandoned buildings always gave off that vibe. As I made my way deeper inside, I found a room filled with old filing cabinets and paperwork, scattered haphazardly. Some of the papers were faded and barely legible, but I noticed a few that seemed out of place. They were newer, clean, bright white as if they'd been recently added. Curious, I thumbed through the stack, finding scribbled notes and numbers, mostly unintelligible. One note caught my eye. It read, "They're still here." I froze. My skin crawled. The factory was silent except for the faint creaking of old machinery shifting. The words felt out of place, disturbing. Who could have written this? And how could they be still here when there was no sign of life? I was about to leave when I heard it. A faint whispering, barely audible but unmistakable. I stood still, straining to listen. The whispering grew louder, like 1,000 voices murmuring all at once. It was coming from deeper inside the factory, where the shadows were darkest. The whispers seemed to call my name, though I couldn't make out the exact words. My breath caught as I felt something brush past my leg. I jumped back, heart pounding, but there was nothing. Just the cold air and the oppressive silence. I wanted to run, but something inside held me in place. My curiosity had always been my downfall. I forced myself to keep moving, stepping further into the factory. The whispers turned into faint guttural murmurs, almost like someone speaking in a language I couldn't understand. That's when I saw it, a figure standing at the end of a long corridor. It wasn't moving, just standing there, silent. I couldn't make out its face, just a vague, shadowy shape. My stomach churned. The whispers turned into a low, rhythmic chanting. I didn't know how long I stood there, frozen, staring at the figure. It felt like time had stopped, the only sounds being the chanting and my own frantic heartbeat. Then, suddenly, it moved, slowly, deliberately. I couldn't tell if it was coming toward me or standing still. But as it took a step, I noticed the shadows in the room growing darker, shifting unnaturally like they were alive. I turned to run, but my legs wouldn't respond. The chanting grew louder, overwhelming, and then silence. Complete, deafening silence. The whispers had stopped, but something was wrong. So wrong. I was hyper-aware of my surroundings now, every creak and groan of the factory amplifying in my ears. The figure was gone. The hallway was empty. I stumbled back toward the entrance, my breath coming in shallow gasps. As I reached the door, I turned around one last time. The factory was still as death, the machinery still and lifeless. But through one of the broken windows, I swear I saw something. A shadow, far off in the distance, just standing there, watching. I don't know what I saw, or who, or what was there with me. I left the factory that day, and I've never gone back. I'm not sure if whatever was there ever really left. I was 13 when it happened, during a summer trip to my grandparents' old farmhouse. It wasn't just any trip, it was supposed to be a simple visit, full of farmland sunsets and lazy afternoons. But from the moment we arrived, something felt wrong. The farmhouse itself was isolated, sitting at the edge of an overgrown field, far from any neighboring houses. My parents assured me it was just an old family home, quiet and peaceful. But from the moment I walked in, a strange sense of unease took hold. That first night, I couldn't sleep. The old wooden floorboards groaned under the weight of each step, and the creaking of the house seemed louder in the silence than it should have been. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, when I heard a faint rhythmic tapping. It wasn't coming from inside the house, it was from outside. At first, I dismissed it as some small animal, maybe a bird or a raccoon, but the tapping grew louder and more deliberate as the hours passed. In the morning, I asked my grandmother about the noise. She shrugged, a little smile playing on her lips. Just the old trees. The wind does strange things out here. But the look in her eyes said she didn't believe it either. The days passed, but the tapping never stopped. It wasn't just random anymore. It was constant. I began to hear it even when I was awake, echoing through the empty halls of the farmhouse. The feeling of being watched grew stronger, and no matter where I went, I felt like I was being followed by unseen eyes. One afternoon, I decided to explore the surrounding fields. They stretched out for miles, untouched by modern life, just the way they had been for decades. The air was thick with the scent of hay and soil. The trees creaked gently as the wind picked up, adding to the eerie atmosphere. I wandered far from the farmhouse until I could no longer see the building. That's when I saw it. A figure. Not far from where I stood, barely visible beneath the branches of a gnarled oak tree. It wasn't moving, just standing there, staring in my direction. My breath caught in my throat. The figure was tall, too tall, its form distorted as if it didn't belong in the world. I couldn't make out its face, only dark, hollow eyes that seemed to sink into its head, lifeless and empty. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The figure remained still, unmoving, as though waiting for me. Slowly, I raised my hand, and with a trembling finger, I pointed. The figure didn't react. It didn't flinch or move. It just stood there, silent and endless. The tapping continued. Only now it wasn't coming from the trees anymore. It seemed to come from within me, a dull rhythm that echoed in my ears. I felt like I was being pulled toward the figure, drawn in by something I couldn't understand. I don't know how much time passed before I finally turned and ran. My legs moved faster than they ever had, back toward the farmhouse. The figure never followed. It simply watched, unmoving, as I fled. That night, as I lay in bed, I could still hear the tapping. It was quieter now, but still there, persistent and unrelenting. I realized that whatever I had seen wasn't something I could run from. It had become a part of me. We left the farmhouse the next day, but the tapping never stopped. I can still hear it sometimes, especially in the quiet moments when I'm alone. It's there, just beyond the edge of my vision, waiting. It was supposed to be a quiet evening out, just me and a few friends. We decided to explore an old abandoned theater that had been shut down for decades. The place was a relic, decaying with its crumbling facade and faded marquee. The theater had always been known for its eerie history, rumors of strange occurrences, unexplained disappearances, and whispers of something lurking in the shadows. We weren't expecting much beyond a few creepy sights and maybe some unsettling stories to tell afterward. It wasn't far from town, but far enough that no one really ventured there anymore. The building was dark, with broken windows and faded paint. The sign above the entrance flickered intermittently, creating fleeting glimpses of the name Riverview Theater. We stepped inside, the smell of decay hitting us immediately. Dust hung thick in the air, and the old red velvet seats were tattered and stained. The theater was massive, with the grand stage still intact, though the paint was peeling, revealing layers of once vibrant murals beneath. As we wandered deeper into the building, there was a strange silence. The creaks of the old floorboards echoed around us, amplifying every step we took. The air felt cold, unnatural. I shivered and glanced around, wondering if we'd come too far into a place that wasn't supposed to be disturbed. That's when things started getting strange. We found ourselves in what remained of the lobby. The front doors had long been boarded up, but there was a door behind the counter leading to the projection room. My friends and I hesitated, but curiosity got the better of us. I led the way, opening the door slowly. Inside was a long hallway lit by dim, flickering bulbs. The walls were lined with faded, yellowing posters of long-forgotten movies. As we moved down the hall, the floor creaked beneath our feet, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. The projection room at the end of the hall was locked. The old rusted door refused to budge no matter how much we pushed. I pulled out my phone to get a better look, and that's when I saw the graffiti etched into the wall. "We're watching you." My blood ran cold, and I realized that whoever wrote that wasn't kidding. I turned around, and that's when I noticed something. A figure, just a faint silhouette, standing at the back of the theater. It was obscured by the shadows, but its presence sent a wave of fear crashing over me. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, but deep down, I knew better. I grabbed my flashlight, shining it in the direction of the figure. The light danced across the shadows, revealing nothing. The figure had vanished. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. No response. We decided it was time to leave. Fast. But as we made our way back to the lobby, the door behind us slammed shut, cutting us off from the exit. Panic set in as we tried to force the door open, but it wouldn't budge. The sound of our breathing echoed in the empty theater, growing louder with every passing second. Suddenly, we heard a noise from above, the creaking of footsteps, slow, deliberate. My flashlight caught a glimpse of movement on the balcony. I froze, shining the beam up toward the second level. A figure stood there, staring down at us. This time, there was no mistaking it. The figure had no face, just an empty void where the eyes should have been. Its silhouette seemed to blur, shifting and stretching in a way that was unnatural. "Run!" I shouted. We bolted toward the main entrance, tripping over ourselves in our haste. The air seemed to grow colder with each passing second. The door, however, was still sealed shut. In desperation, I turned back to the balcony, expecting to see the figure again. Instead, I saw something far worse. It wasn't a figure at all. It was a screen, glowing faintly. But the screen wasn't showing any movie. It was showing us. There we were, standing at the front of the theater, faces frozen in horror. But something was wrong. Our reflections weren't acting like we were. The shadows, the empty eyes, they weren't reflections at all. They were watching us, mimicking us. I could barely comprehend what I was seeing when the screen went dark. The theater was plunged into total darkness, except for the faint glow of my phone. My friends and I managed to break free from the building somehow, sprinting into the night, not stopping until we reached the edge of town. The old theater remained behind us, a broken, silent shell under the pale moonlight. We never spoke of what we saw that night, and we never went back. It was a warm summer evening when my friends and I decided to take a trip to a nearby lake. The lake was small, tucked away between rolling hills and dense forests. It wasn't particularly popular, more of a hidden gem that locals like to keep quiet. We had heard stories of how peaceful it was, a perfect spot to relax under the stars. I thought it would be a calm escape from the noise of everyday life, something we all needed. The drive there was quiet, the road winding through thick woods, the sun dipping low on the horizon. When we finally arrived, the lake stretched out before us, reflecting the orange glow of the setting sun. We set up a few blankets and chairs, unpacked a picnic, and watched as the last rays of light faded into the trees. For a while, everything felt idyllic. The air was cool, the breeze gentle. We ate, talked, and joked about the usual things: work, relationships, and what we'd be doing the rest of the summer. The only sounds were the rustling leaves and the occasional splash of water. As night began to fall, we could see the first stars starting to peek through the darkening sky. The only light was from our small battery-powered lantern. It cast long shadows across the shore. We decided to take a walk along the lakeside, following a narrow, worn trail that led into the woods. The path curved gently, the trees towering over us, their leaves whispering softly in the breeze. It was peaceful, serene. I told myself how lucky we were to have found this quiet escape, away from the chaos of the world. That's when things began to shift. We had been walking for maybe 20 minutes when we noticed something odd. The sounds of nature seemed off. No chirping insects, no rustling leaves. It was too quiet. Even the gentle lapping of the water against the shore had stopped. Maybe we went too far, one of my friends said, glancing nervously around at the darkening forest. I shook my head, trying to brush it off. It's probably just the woods settling. Happens sometimes. We kept walking, but my gut told me something wasn't right. The trees seemed closer now, more oppressive, their shadows stretching longer. The path itself had started to feel more narrow, as if the forest was closing in around us. Then came the first sound. Low, distant, but unmistakable. A faint, unsettling whimper. I stopped in my tracks, listening. My friends turned to me, their faces pale. "Did you hear that?" one of them whispered. I nodded, though my throat had gone dry. The sound came again, clearer this time. A soft, mournful cry like someone was in pain. It echoed through the woods, bouncing off the trees and vanishing into the darkness. I'd never heard anything like it before. "We should go back," one of them said. Their voice was trembling, but before we could turn around, we heard it again. This time, much closer. It was like the cry was following us. My pulse quickened. I felt trapped, unable to shake the feeling that whatever was making that noise wasn't human. "Guys, we're too far in," someone said. "We need to get back. Now." But as we hurried to turn around, something caught my eye. A figure standing just beyond the edge of the trees. It wasn't human, at least not entirely. Its shape was twisted, distorted, and it seemed to blend with the shadows around it. I couldn't make out its face, just the faint glimmer of pale, empty eyes. I froze. My friends stopped too, noticing the same thing. None of us could speak, our breath catching in our throats as the figure took a step forward. It wasn't moving like a person. It was slow, deliberate, as though each step was agonizingly unnatural. The cry came again, louder, as if the figure were trying to communicate. Though what it wanted, I couldn't fathom. "Run," I whispered, and my voice cracked. Without hesitation, we turned and sprinted back toward the lake, the sound of our pounding footsteps echoing in the stillness. We didn't look back. When we finally reached the shore, we collapsed onto the blankets, gasping for air. The lake was still there, dark and calm under the moonlight, but the figure, whatever it was gone. None of us spoke for a long time. We packed up our things in silence, our minds racing. Whatever had been out there wasn't something we could explain, and part of me is still afraid it might still be watching. We haven't gone back to that lake. My friends and I had been planning a hiking trip for weeks, a chance to escape the city and immerse ourselves in the quiet, untouched beauty of the mountains. We were tired of screens and the constant noise of everyday life. This would be our chance to disconnect and recharge. The trailhead was only about an hour's drive from town, and we arrived just as the sun was beginning to set. The air was crisp, and the towering pines stretched endlessly in every direction. The trail was well worn, though not overly crowded. It was perfect, As we started the hike, the conversations flowed, and we basked in the sounds of nature, the crunch of gravel beneath our feet, the soft rustling of leaves, and the distant call of birds. We decided to set up camp a few miles in, beside a stream that meandered through the forest. The spot felt isolated and peaceful, exactly what we were looking for. As we set up our tents and built a fire, the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the ground. That's when it started. At first, it was subtle, a faint rustling in the underbrush. I figured it was just some wildlife, maybe a deer or a squirrel. But as the evening deepened, the sounds grew more distinct. It wasn't just the rustling anymore. There were footsteps. Quiet at first, but steady, following us. I stopped and turned around, expecting to see one of my friends, but no one was there. The woods were still except for the distant hum of insects. I didn't say anything to the others. I didn't want to worry them, but my nerves were already fraying. Every step we took, I felt like we were being watched. The sounds of the forest, which had been so comforting earlier, now felt oppressive. It wasn't just wildlife out there anymore. By the time we made it to camp, the shadows had grown long and deep. The fire we built crackled loudly, and we huddled close, trying to keep warm. I kept my eyes on the tree line, expecting to see someone emerge, but nothing ever came. It wasn't until later, after we had settled in, that I noticed something strange. The footsteps, whatever was following us, they had stopped. The forest was silent once again, but it wasn't a comforting silence. It felt wrong, hollow, as though something had vanished. I woke up a few hours later, shivering. The fire had burned down to a few glowing embers, but the night was still warm. I stepped out of my tent, hoping some fresh air would calm me. As I stood there, looking at the quiet trees, I noticed something bizarre. The usual sounds of the night, the rustling of leaves, the distant chirp of crickets, were gone. The forest was completely still. Then I heard it, a soft, uneven breathing. It was coming from the woods, just beyond the tree line. My blood ran cold. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I was rooted in place, unable to tear my eyes away from the dark. The breathing grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't human, that much was clear. It was shallow, labored, almost as if whatever was out there was struggling to draw air. The sound wasn't far from where we had camped, but the direction was unclear. I felt like whatever was out there was looking for us, and now that it had found us, it was circling closer. A chill ran down my spine as I realized something. Those footsteps earlier, they weren't just following us. They were guiding something toward us, toward the camp. I could feel the presence growing closer. My mind raced with thoughts. Should I wake my friends? But what could I tell them? I didn't want to put them in more danger than they already were. Instead, I grabbed my flashlight and shined it toward the woods, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever was out there. For a moment, there was nothing, just the endless shadows and the faint rustling of leaves. And then I saw it. A figure. Tall, obscured by darkness but unmistakable. Its form wasn't human. It seemed wrong, like something twisted and unnatural. It stared at me from the edge of the trees, unmoving, its hollow eyes glinting in the faint light of my flashlight. My heart thudded in my chest as I stared back, frozen in place. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The figure took a step forward, and I could see now, the uneven, staggering gait as if it wasn't fully human. The outline of its face was blurred, almost as if it wasn't meant to be seen. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, it vanished into the woods. The breathing stopped. The silence returned. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. My friends never woke up. By dawn, I convinced myself that whatever it was gone. I woke them and told them we needed to leave, that I wasn't feeling well. None of them questioned it. We hiked out of the forest, and I've never gone back. I've tried to convince myself it was just fear and exhaustion, that I imagined everything. But even now, I can't forget those hollow eyes staring from the darkness. Whatever it was, I don't believe we were alone that night. It was a late afternoon when I found myself walking through an unfamiliar forest. The dense trees stretched endlessly, their branches arching over the narrow trail, casting long, wavering shadows that danced in the fading light. The forest was eerily quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the crunch of my boots on the dirt path. I wasn't supposed to be here. I'd gotten lost after taking a wrong turn while hiking alone. My phone had died hours ago, and now the sun was dipping below the horizon, leaving the forest in an unnatural twilight. My heart pounded as I tried to find a way back, but the trail seemed to have vanished, leaving only a maze of trees and endless undergrowth. As the sky darkened, a chill swept through the trees. I shivered, wishing I'd brought a jacket. The quiet was becoming suffocating, oppressive. Something about it felt wrong. The wind had stopped entirely, and the usual rustling of leaves was replaced by an eerie stillness that felt almost alive. I stumbled upon an old cabin, its roof caved in and windows broken, almost blending into the surrounding woods. It stood as if untouched by time, untouched by human life. I hesitated at the threshold, the memory of horror movies flashing in my mind. But the thought of spending the night out here, lost and alone, was worse. The interior of the cabin was dark, musty, and filled with the scent of decay. Old furniture lay scattered, rotting in the corners while cobwebs stretched from wall to wall. I could feel the weight of the silence pressing down on me. As I stepped further inside, the feeling of unease intensified, as if I wasn't alone. Something was watching me. I could feel it in the way the air seemed to thicken, in the cold that seeped into my bones. My breath came out in shaky puffs as I tried to shake the feeling, telling myself it was just my nerves. I fumbled in my bag, pulling out a flashlight, its beam cutting through the dim darkness. The shadows around me writhed as I moved, forming distorted shapes on the cracked walls. Then I heard it, a faint whisper, barely audible, as if someone were standing right beside me, murmuring words I couldn't quite make out. My stomach twisted, and I swung the flashlight around, scanning the cabin. The only sound was the creak of the old wooden floor beneath my feet. "Who's there?" My voice trembled, echoing in the hollow space. No answer. I listened closely, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. The whisper came again, but this time louder, clearer. It was a name, soft but unmistakable. Sarah. I froze. My name wasn't Sarah. I spun around, the flashlight beam darting across the room, searching for any sign of movement. Nothing. Just empty, rotting furniture and the lingering darkness. My pulse thundered in my ears as I clutched the flashlight tighter, wondering if I was imagining things. Sarah. The voice was closer this time. My heart pounded as I realized it wasn't just in my head. It sounded familiar, almost like it was coming from inside my own thoughts. I stumbled toward the door, but as I reached out for the handle, I noticed something. Another whisper, fainter this time, coming from the corner of the cabin. Help. It wasn't a sound. It was a feeling. A presence in the room, as if something was leaning over my shoulder, breathing cold air into my ear. I spun around again, but there was no one there. The whisper grew louder, repeating over and over again like a loop I couldn't escape. Desperate, I tore through the cabin, my flashlight cutting through the darkness, but every corner was empty. Every step I took felt heavier, the air more suffocating. Then I heard it, closer than ever. A low, guttural voice right behind me. "Look." I whipped around, the flashlight beam illuminating the figure. But there was nothing, only my distorted reflection on the cracked mirror hanging on the wall. My breath hitched as I realized the reflection wasn't mine. The figure in the mirror had hollow eyes, its face twisted in a sick grin, its mouth moving but no sound coming out. Suddenly, the whisper stopped. The air went cold, the forest beyond the cabin silent again. I stood there, frozen, unable to move. The flashlight trembled in my hand as I turned back toward the door. As I pushed it open and stepped out into the fading light, I could feel something behind me. The whisper had vanished, but the echo of my name still hung in the air. It wasn't over. It started as an ordinary weekend trip with a few friends. We'd decided to go hiking on a trail deep in the mountains. None of us had been there before, but the online reviews promised breathtaking views and quiet solitude, far from the noise of city life. The plan was simple: hike during the day, camp overnight, and return refreshed. But something about that trail didn't feel right from the start. The first few miles were beautiful. The air was crisp, the forest thick with towering pines, and the only sounds were birdsong and the crunch of gravel beneath our boots. We stopped often, marveling at the view as we climbed higher. The trail was marked clearly, and there were no other hikers around, which wasn't unusual given how secluded the place was. By midday, we were deep into the forest, far from any sign of civilization. It wasn't until we reached the fork in the trail that things started to feel strange. The sign was old and faded, barely legible. One path led to the summit, the other to a clearing near a river. We debated for a bit, but decided to head toward the clearing. Something about the summit felt off. The clearing was beautiful. We set up camp there, unpacking our gear and gathering wood for a fire. The river ran nearby, its gentle sound soothing in the quiet. We were tired from the hike and settled into the camp, enjoying the peace and solitude. That night, around midnight, something woke me. It wasn't a sound, it was more like a shift in the atmosphere. The air had become heavier and the forest felt still, too still. I lay there, heart racing, listening. At first, there was nothing, just silence. Then I heard it. Soft footsteps. They weren't human footsteps. They were lighter, quicker, and moving in circles around our camp. I sat up, freezing, trying to make sense of the noise. The others were asleep, unaware of what was happening. I grabbed my flashlight, shining it toward the sound. Nothing. Just shadows moving beyond the reach of the beam. I stood, trying to calm myself, telling myself it was probably an animal. But as I scanned the clearing, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was out there wasn't driven by instinct. It was watching us. The footsteps grew closer, slower. They circled the camp like something was observing us from the trees. I could hear breathing, shallow and raspy, echoing through the stillness. My pulse thundered in my ears, and I backed away from the tent. That's when I saw it. Just a glimpse, but enough to make my blood run cold. A figure, tall and thin, standing at the edge of the clearing. Its face was obscured by the darkness, but its eyes, they glowed faintly, like dull embers. It didn't move, didn't approach, but I could feel its gaze locked on me. I stumbled backward, trying to wake my friends. My voice was hoarse as I called out, but they didn't stir. The figure remained, unmoving, as if frozen in place. I grabbed my phone, desperate to call for help, but there was no signal. My hands shook as I tried to think of what to do. That's when I noticed something strange. The trees. There were no shadows. Everything was bathed in a dim, unnatural light. The forest wasn't as dark as it should have been. The figure moved slightly, almost as if it had heard me, its silhouette more defined now. I didn't wait. Grabbing my pack, I ran for the river, heart pounding in my chest. The sound of my own footsteps echoed through the stillness, but I didn't dare look back. I followed the river, trying to escape whatever was behind me. Hours later, I stumbled into a small town, miles away from the trail. My clothes were torn, my legs scratched from running through the woods. I collapsed at the first building I saw, an old gas station, battered and out of breath. The clerk at the counter looked at me confused. "What happened?" he asked, his voice echoing in the empty space. I wanted to explain, to tell him about the figure, the footsteps, the silence. But no words would come. I never went back to the mountains, never hiked another trail. Sometimes, in the quiet of the night, I wonder if it's still out there, waiting. I've always loved the ocean. There's something about the vastness of it that feels both calming and terrifying at the same time. It was a clear summer evening when I decided to take a solo trip to the coast, something I did occasionally when I wanted to clear my mind. The beach was nearly empty, just the way I liked it, except for a few distant figures walking along the shore. I parked my car at the edge of the cliffs and made my way down to the sand. The salty air filled my lungs, and the sound of waves crashing against the shore was strangely soothing. I walked along the shore, the soft sound of my footsteps mixing with the distant roar of the ocean. The sun was dipping lower, casting long shadows across the sand. As I walked further down the beach, I noticed something unusual. There, near the water's edge, was a figure standing still. At first, I thought it was someone watching the waves, but there was something off about them. The figure wasn't moving. I approached cautiously, the soft crunch of the sand underfoot growing louder as I got closer. It wasn't until I was just a few feet away that I could see them clearly. It was a woman, standing with her back to me, her long, flowing hair trailing down her back. The waves crashed around her, but she didn't flinch. "Excuse me," I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. She didn't move. I took another step closer, my heart starting to race. There was something eerie about the way she stood there, motionless, as though she wasn't part of the world. Her shoulders were slack and she didn't seem to notice me. As I reached out to touch her gently, her head turned slowly, almost mechanically towards me. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow and void of any life. My stomach twisted into knots as I stumbled back a few steps. "Who are you?" I asked, but she didn't speak. She simply stared at me, her expression blank. A cold breeze swept across the shore, carrying with it a faint, mournful wail from the distance. The woman remained still, staring at me with those lifeless eyes. I couldn't look away, my body frozen in place. Then, without warning, she turned and started walking into the ocean. The waves swallowed her, the water rising higher, consuming her figure completely. My heart pounded as I stood there, unable to move or speak. When I finally regained my senses, there was no sign of her. The beach was empty again, as if nothing had happened. I stood there for what felt like hours, staring out at the horizon, trying to make sense of what I had just witnessed. I've never gone back to that beach since. It was an ordinary Saturday morning when my friends and I decided to take a trip out to an old lake, tucked away from civilization. We were looking for something remote, peaceful, a way to escape the noise of daily life. The drive was long, and as we got further from the city, the landscape changed from paved roads to dusty trails and towering trees. The lake itself was beautiful, serene, surrounded by dense forest. We'd read about it online, something about its still, clear waters and the promise of tranquility. The plan was simple: hike around the lake, find a nice spot to set up camp, and spend the day swimming, fishing, and lounging by the shore. When we arrived, we were the only ones there. It felt like we had the entire lake to ourselves, the kind of solitude you only find when you're far away from everything. We unpacked our gear and set up camp, the sound of birds and the rustling of leaves the only things breaking the silence. As the sun dipped lower and the air cooled, we went to the shore to relax. The lake was calm, the water reflecting the orange glow of the sunset. We joked and laughed, tossing pebbles into the water, the sound echoing in the stillness of the woods. It was the kind of peace we'd all been craving. But that peace didn't last. It started with a noise, a distant, hollow thump. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe it was an animal or just the wind carrying strange sounds from deeper in the forest. But as the evening wore on, the thumping became more distinct, more deliberate. It wasn't fading away either. It seemed to be getting closer. I glanced at my friends, their faces mirroring my unease. None of us said anything at first, not wanting to ruin the atmosphere. But the thumps persisted. and now I could hear something else. Soft whispers, barely audible, carried on the breeze. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. One of my friends, Sam, broke the silence. "Did you guys hear that?" We all nodded, uneasy. The sound was closer now. Too close. It wasn't just in the distance anymore. It was almost as if whatever was making those sounds was right there, just out of sight. We tried to convince ourselves it was probably an animal, maybe a deer or some other forest creature. But whatever it wasn't leaving. The thumping was steady, relentless, and the whispers felt like they were growing louder. "Let's go check it out," Sam suggested, his voice trembling slightly. None of us were particularly eager, but curiosity outweighed our fear. We gathered our flashlights and followed the sound deeper into the woods. The trees became denser, the air cooler, and the silence seemed to press in on us. The whispers were unmistakable now, low and guttural, spoken in a language I couldn't recognize. It was almost like they were speaking directly into my head, as if they knew I could hear them. Suddenly, the thumping stopped. The forest became eerily still again, and for a moment I thought we'd lost whatever had been making the noise. But then, just as I was about to speak, I heard it, the sound of footsteps. Not ours. These steps were slow, deliberate, and there were far too many of them. We stopped in our tracks, shining our flashlights into the trees, but there was nothing. No one there. Yet the footsteps continued, growing louder, as though they were circling us, closing in. Then, out of the corner of my flashlight beam, I saw them. Shadows, dozens of them, moving through the trees. They weren't human, not exactly. More like distorted shapes, figures with no faces, no features, just black voids where they should have been. They didn't run. They glided through the forest with an unnatural, fluid grace. We couldn't speak. We couldn't move. The shadows drew closer, closing the space between us. I could feel their presence, their gaze upon us, even though there was nothing to see. It was as if they were pulling us in, whispering promises of silence and darkness. The forest seemed to breathe, the trees swaying gently as if they too were part of whatever was watching us. I felt as though I was being drawn towards something beyond comprehension. Then, as suddenly as they appeared, the shadows vanished, leaving only silence. We stood there, frozen in place, the echoes of their whispers still ringing in my ears. It wasn't until we realized that the lake, once visible through the trees, was no longer in sight. We had wandered too far into the woods, far from where we had set up camp. Panic set in as we realized we were lost, but deep down, I knew whatever had followed us would never leave, at least not entirely. The day started like any other. I had been hiking on a trail deep in the mountains, a place I had visited countless times before. It was my usual escape, a chance to clear my head and breathe in the crisp mountain air. But something felt different that day, like the woods themselves were holding their breath, waiting for me to step further in. The trail twisted through towering trees, their branches arching over the path like ancient sentinels. I had always loved this trail. Its solitude, the sense of being far from the noise of the world. It was peaceful, or so I thought. I hiked for hours, the sound of my footsteps crunching beneath the dry leaves the only company. By midday, the sunlight had started to filter through the canopy, creating long, shifting shadows that danced along the forest floor. I paused, taking a swig of water from my bottle and looking around. The trees were older now, their trunks gnarled and thick, as though they had stood there for centuries untouched. That's when I heard it. A faint whispering, almost like the wind. But there was no wind. It came from deeper within the woods, soft and almost melodic. I strained to hear, but the whispering faded before I could make out any words. Shaking my head, I convinced myself it was just my imagination, a trick of the quiet. But the whispering returned, this time louder, closer. It wasn't the wind, and now I was certain I wasn't alone. The hairs on my neck stood up, and I found myself moving cautiously, following the sound, though every instinct in me screamed to turn back. As I pressed deeper into the woods, the trees seemed to close in. The air grew colder, almost as if the forest itself was watching. My breath came in short bursts, each step feeling heavier than the last. The whispering had grown to a near silence, like something was speaking just out of reach, a voice that wanted to be heard but never could be. Then I saw it. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, but there, standing between two trees, was a figure. It wasn't tall, nor did it move like a human. Its shape was indistinct, like a mass of shadows pulled together. It seemed to be watching me, though its eyes, if it even had eyes, were dark, hollow voids. Fear tightened my chest, but I forced myself to stay still. The figure didn't move, didn't react to my presence. It just stood there, unmoving, like it had been waiting for me. I wanted to turn and run, but my legs wouldn't obey. I couldn't look away. Then the whispering returned, more distinct this time. It wasn't words, but something deeper, something primal and ancient. The figure began to shift, its shape contorting and stretching in unnatural ways. It wasn't human, I knew that much, but it wasn't entirely creature either. Who are you? I whispered, my voice trembling. There was no response, only the whispering, growing louder now, almost deafening. My head throbbed, the sound reverberating in my skull. I squeezed my eyes shut, hoping it would go away, but when I opened them again, the figure was closer. Its shadowy form had shifted again, growing darker, more defined. Panic surged through me, and I stumbled backward, my foot catching on a root. I fell, the rough ground scraping against my palms. I looked up, expecting to see the figure looming over me, but it was gone. The whispering faded, leaving only the sound of my own breath. Breathing heavily, I scrambled to my feet, my hands still trembling. I didn't dare look back as I made my way out of the woods. The trees seemed to watch me as I passed, their branches creaking, as if they knew I had been there. It wasn't until I reached the trailhead that I stopped. I turned to look back at the forest, but all I saw was the quiet, empty trees. The figure was gone, the whispering had vanished, but the feeling of being followed, watched, lingered. I never returned to that trail. Whatever had been waiting for me in those woods, I knew I could never escape it. And sometimes, when I'm alone, I can still hear the faint whispering, as if it's calling to me from the edge of the trees. It started with a simple drive. I had always been fascinated by old lighthouses, drawn to their solitude and the stories they seemed to hold. So, one weekend, I decided to take a trip to an isolated one perched on a cliff by the sea. It was something I'd always wanted to do, something to escape from the noise of daily life. The lighthouse was miles away from any town or signs of human life. The drive to get there was long, winding through narrow, desolate roads with nothing but trees and rocky cliffs on either side. The closer I got, the more the world seemed to shrink. By the time I arrived, the sun had begun to set, casting a long, eerie glow over the water below. The lighthouse stood tall, its white paint peeling and windows dark. The air smelled of salt and brine, and the only sound was the crashing waves below. I parked my car and began the short hike up the steep path leading to the base of the lighthouse. The only other thing besides the distant roar of the sea was the silence that seemed to engulf everything. When I reached the entrance, I pushed open the heavy wooden door. The inside was musty and cold, with narrow, spiraling stairs leading to the top. Each step groaned beneath my feet as I climbed. It wasn't long before I reached the top, where the view was breathtaking. The sea stretched out before me, endless and unforgiving. I stood there, lost in the beauty of it all, when something made me glance back toward the stairs. For a moment, I thought I saw someone standing there, silhouetted against the narrow frame of the doorway. My stomach twisted, and my heart skipped a beat. But when I turned fully around, there was no one there. I told myself it was just the shadows playing tricks. The wind whistled through the small broken windows, and I shivered. forcing the creeping unease to the back of my mind. As I took in the view again, I thought about the stories of ships lost at sea, the lonely keepers who had watched from these towers for generations. The idea of isolation felt comforting until I realized that I wasn't alone. Not truly. There was something off about the silence, the absence of birds, the usual sounds of life. Everything was too still, the kind of silence that made your ears ring. I made my way back down the stairs, each creak of the wood beneath me echoing. When I reached the bottom, the door was shut. How had I not noticed that before? The door hadn't moved on its own. My heart raced again as I reached for the handle, only to find it locked from the inside. I was trapped. Panic hit me hard. I checked my phone, but there was no signal. The lighthouse stood in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by nothing but ocean and cliffs. I tried to open the door, banging on it, shouting for help, but there was no one around. The sound of my own voice felt hollow in the empty space. I spent what felt like hours trying to find a way out, but the door refused to budge. It was as if something had sealed it behind me, something I couldn't see or understand. The fear grew, sinking into every part of me. The thought that I might be trapped here, in this ancient lighthouse where the echoes of the past lingered, was too much to bear. When I finally slumped to the floor, exhausted and hopeless, I noticed something strange. The silence seemed to have shifted. Not just quiet, it was as if the world itself had grown quieter. The air was still, heavy, as though time had stopped. I closed my eyes, trying to steady my breathing, when I heard it. The faint sound of a distant bell, soft and low. It wasn't coming from inside the lighthouse, it was from the sea. The bell rang again, louder this time. It echoed off the cliffs, and I couldn't tell if it was real or some strange, haunting memory. My stomach turned as I realized there was no ship in sight, no boat or rescue, just the sound of a bell calling from the void. Trembling, I stood up and went to the window, pressing my face against the cold glass. Below, far out on the water, I saw a flicker of light, dim, almost ghostly. It moved closer, but the lighthouse had no boats or ships. No life should have been out there. I forced myself to look away, but the bell continued, growing louder and more insistent. I didn't know if it was real, or if my mind was playing tricks, but I knew one thing. The lighthouse wasn't just keeping watch over the sea. It felt like the sea was watching me. I never saw anyone outside, never found a way out. But the bell still echoes in my mind, always just out of reach. I don't know if anyone else heard it or if I was the only one who ever would.